The cameo left her collar on a Tuesday in March. By nightfall, it lay in a pawnbroker's drawer on Bedford Street. Arabella Fairfax was 22, and the ink stain on her right forefinger had outlasted every gown she owned. In a garret above a chandler's shop, she smoothed a fawn muslin frock, mended her gloves once more, and folded a copy of the Times where a single advertisement had been circled in pencil. A reader was wanted at Harrowden House. The blind Duke required a steady voice and Latin without stumbling. She walked the length of Mayfair in worn half-boots. A footman in Harrowden livery led her through halls of cold marble to a library where the curtains had been drawn against a light the master could no longer see. Sebastian Marbury, Duke of Harrowden, stood at the window with his back to her. Tall, still, one gloved hand resting on an ebony cane, a fine saber scar running the length of his jaw. His ice-pale eyes did not turn when she entered. She opened Ovid and began to read. Her voice trembled only once, on the second line. When she finished, the silence in the room stretched long enough to feel like judgment. "Repeat the last line," he said quietly, and then, after a pause, she would remember for the rest of her life. "I have heard that voice before." He did not tell her where. Not yet. But that afternoon, seated in a shaft of dust-lit sun, in a house that was not hers, Arabella Fairfax did not know that a single sentence had already begun to rearrange the whole shape of her life. Before the story begins, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of justice, dignity, and love that arrives against all odds move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. March of 1820 pressed thin sleet against the dormer glass of a lodging house on Bedford Street, and in the attic at the top of 4 flights of narrow stairs, Arabella Fairfax sat mending the same seam for the 3rd time that week. The candle at her elbow guttered whenever the wind found the gap under the eaves. She did not look up from the needle. Her right forefinger, marked at the pad with a permanent stain of India ink, guided the thread with the small, exact patience of a woman who had long ago learned that haste ruined fawn muslin. The seam held. She bit the thread, tied it, smoothed the skirt across her knee. On the deal table beside her lay a copy of the Times 2 days old, a stub of pencil, and a chipped saucer with 3 coins in it. She counted the coins by touch without looking. 3 shillings, 1 sixpence, and a bent penny. Not enough for the week's rent, and the week's rent was owed at 9 that morning. She rose. The attic ceiling forced her to bow her head near the window, and she stayed a moment in that stoop, one hand on the sill, listening to the coal cart grind past below. Chimney smoke lay flat over the roofs of Covent Garden. Somewhere a bell was ringing 7. At the little glass above the wash basin, she pinned back the loose curls at her temples and secured the cameo of ivory at her throat. The cameo was small, the profile of a woman with hair coiled in the antique style. On the back, if a thumb searched for it, ran a hairline crack. She let her thumb search. She had done it every morning for 5 years. Then she took the paper from the table, folded it once, tucked the pencil behind her ear, and unhooked her mother's cameo from the collar. The clasp was stiff. She warmed it a moment between her palms before it gave. She laid the cameo in the middle of a square of clean linen and folded the corners over it with the care one might use for a sleeping child. That done, she went downstairs. Mrs. Hodge kept her parlor on the ground floor, and her parlor was warm because Mrs. Hodge had first claim on the coal. She was already at her breakfast when Arabella knocked, a pot of black tea between her elbows and a slice of buttered bread arrested halfway to her mouth. She did not put the bread down when Arabella entered. She looked, chewed, swallowed, and only then set the crust on the rim of her plate. "Rent," she said. "Mrs. Hodge, if I might trouble you for a minute more of your patience." "You had a fortnight of patience, Miss Fairfax. You had my patience through the funeral, and through what came after the funeral, and through a Christmas quarter when the coal was 9 pence a scuttle." Mrs. Hodge lifted her cup. "You've a face that begs prettier than most. That is not the same as coin." Arabella laid the little linen bundle on the corner of the tea table. She did not open it. She placed her fingertips beside it, as if the object required a witness on either side. "I have no coin yet this morning," she said. "I have something in pledge. I do not run a pawn shop. You run a boarding house. A boarding house wants a lodger who pays this afternoon, rather than a stranger who pays never. Take the pledge until 3. I shall bring the money at 3. Mrs. Hodge looked at the bundle. She looked at Arabella. She reached across, turned back the linen with one finger, and made a small sound in her throat. "Ivory," she said. "My mother's." "Well then." Mrs. Hodge lifted the cameo to the window. The pale light passed through the thin rim of it. She turned it over. Her thumb found the crack at the back, as Arabella's thumb had done. She pursed her mouth. "It is cracked. It is whole where it matters. That is a thing people say about themselves, Miss Fairfax. It is not a thing that fetches money at a shop. I am not asking you to fetch money for it. I am asking you to hold it until 3. Mrs. Hodge weighed the little object on her palm and let out a breath through her nose. She was not a cruel woman. She was a widow who had buried 2 husbands and 1 son, and who counted a shilling as a shilling. "Until 3, she said. "Not 1 minute past. If you are not at that door by the 3rd stroke of the clock at St. Paul's, I sell it to Mr. Levy in Longacre before dusk, and I keep the difference against your next quarter. Are we agreed?" "We are agreed." "Say it plain. You have a way of speaking that makes plain things sound like verses." "We are agreed," Arabella said again, without ornament, and Mrs. Hodge nodded once and shut the cameo into the drawer of the tea table. Out in the passage, Arabella stood a moment, with her hand against the wall. The paper of the wall was old, and where her palm pressed, there was a faint give, as if the house itself were tired. She waited until her breath came evenly. Then she took her bonnet from its peg and went out. The street was full of the ordinary noise of a Wednesday morning. A crossing sweeper worked at the corner, and a girl of about 10 pulled a sack twice her size along the gutter. Arabella tightened the shawl at her elbows. The shawl was wool, and it had been mended in 2 places on the underside. She had mended it herself with thread from a spool, bought for a penny at the haberdasher's near St. Martin's Lane. The bonnet was plain straw, its brim narrow. She walked south, toward the coffee house at the corner of Southampton Street, where a paper cost a penny and a girl could sit if she took a cup. She did not go inside. She stood at the window under the awning, where the day's Times lay open on a lectern for those who could not spare the penny. 2 clerks were reading it. She waited. A boy of 6 or 7, in a coat too long for him, sold roasted chestnuts from a brazier at the curb. The smell reached her, and her stomach, which had had only tea and a heel of yesterday's bread, gave a small, mean turn. She turned her attention deliberately to the printed columns before her. Births, marriages, deaths, the War Office, a ship out of Bristol. She moved her eye down the narrow print of the classifieds. Governesses wanted, no reply to be entertained without written character. A gentleman's companion required at Bath, must play at whist. A firm of solicitors seeking a copyist with a legible hand. She paused at the copyist. The pay was 6 shillings the week. 6 shillings would keep her fed for a fortnight if she kept off tea. She marked the column in her mind and read on. Then, 3 inches lower, in an advertisement set in slightly larger type than its neighbors, she found this. Wanted, at Harrowden House, Grosvenor Square, a gentlewoman of quiet manner and educated voice, to read aloud each afternoon between 4 and 6 o'clock, from books in English, French, and the classical tongues. References of character required. Applications in person this Thursday next at the servants' entrance between the hours of 10 and 12. Ask for Mrs. Pembroke, housekeeper. Arabella read it once. She read it again. She took the pencil from behind her ear and, with the light pressure of a woman aware that other eyes might follow her hand, she made a small, precise ring around the paragraph. Then she unringed it with the flat of her fingernail so that only the faintest indentation remained, so that no one after her would know what she had chosen. She stepped back from the window. The elder of the 2 clerks glanced sideways at her. He had a pleasant face and the ink of long mornings on his cuffs, and he saw the mended shawl, the fawn muslin skirt, the bonnet with its narrow brim, and he saw also the way she held her chin, and he was not sure at once which of the 2 things was true. "Miss," he said, "the paper is public. You may take your minute at it." "Thank you," Arabella said. "I have taken it." She went home. She stopped, on the way, at a little chandler's shop where she was known well enough to be given a slice of yesterday's loaf on trust against the next week. She ate half of it in the street with as much dignity as one may eat half a slice of bread in the street, and she kept the other half wrapped in her handkerchief for the walk to Grosvenor Square on Thursday. That afternoon, at 3 minutes before 3, she was at Mrs. Hodge's door. The rent was in her hand. She had gone to Longacre herself. Not to Mr. Levy, but to Mr. Ross, who kept a smaller shop and paid a fairer price for the sort of thing that could not, in truth, ever be replaced. She had watched him weigh the small gold locket her father had given her on her 12th birthday. She had watched him write a ticket. She had signed her name Arabella Fairfax in the round schoolroom hand her mother had drilled into her before her hands had grown accustomed to grief. At the third stroke of St. Paul's, she laid the coins on Mrs. Hodge's tea table. Mrs. Hodge counted them twice. Then, without speaking, she unlocked the drawer and pushed the linen bundle back across the polished wood. "You are a strange young woman," Mrs. Hodge said. "I am a punctual one," said Arabella. "You do not weep." "There has been enough weeping." "There is always more," Mrs. Hodge said, but her mouth softened at the corners as she said it, and she poured a second cup and pushed it toward the edge of the tea table without further comment. Arabella took it. She drank it standing. Upstairs in the attic, she pinned the cameo back to her collar. She did not look at herself in the little glass while she did it. She sat down at the deal table and drew the paper toward her and set out the pencil, and, from beneath the loose board under her cot, a leather portfolio scarred at the corners. In the portfolio were 3 letters and a small book bound in green calf. The first letter was in her father's hand, dated Elmshaven, the 11th of May, 1815, addressed to a Mr. Carriage of Chancery Lane. It concerned an agreement lately made by Sir Henry Fairfax with a party unnamed, and Sir Henry begged Mr. Carriage to hold the enclosed papers safe until such time as he, Sir Henry, might call for them, which was to say, not later than Michaelmas. Michaelmas had come, and Sir Henry had not called. Michaelmas had come, in fact, 5 times. The second letter was from Mr. Carriage's clerk, dated the following spring, expressing his regret at the death of the late baronet and enclosing 3 receipts and 1 deed, and stating that all other papers relating to the Fairfax estate had, upon the settlement of certain creditors, passed into the hands of a Sir Edmund Halloway of Portman Square, and that any further inquiry ought properly to be addressed to that gentleman. The third letter was Arabella's own, in draft, unsent. She had written it 14 months ago to Sir Edmund Halloway, and had, upon reading it back, folded it into thirds and put it away. It was too proud. She had known it was too proud when she wrote it, and she had written it anyway. The green calf book was her mother's Ovid. It was worn thin at the spine, and the flyleaf bore, in a slanting girlish hand, the name Cecilia Manvers, aged 15, and beneath that, in a firmer later hand, Cecilia Fairfax, and beneath that, in Arabella's own careful copying out at the age of 9, Arabella. 3 generations of women in one flyleaf. The Latin between the boards was Cecilia's. The small pencil markings in the margins were Sir Henry's. The pressed violet at the page of Bacchus and Philemon was Arabella's own, from a summer at Elmshaven when she had been 11, and her mother still alive. She closed the book. She set it on top of the letters. She placed her hand flat on the cover a moment, and then she took her hand away. "Thursday, then," she said aloud, and the attic did not answer her, and she had not expected it to. She did not sleep well that night. Twice she rose to trim the candle, and once to look at the ink mark on her finger, as if it were a thing that belonged to another woman. Thursday came gray. The sleet of Wednesday had passed off in the small hours and left the streets glazed. She was up before 6. She washed her face in cold water from the pitcher, drew a comb through her hair 100 strokes for shine and no more for vanity, coiled it low and simple at the nape, and secured the loose curls with 2 pins of tortoiseshell that had been her mother's. She put on the fawn muslin, buttoned high to the throat as always, and over it the shawl, and over the shawl her one respectable pelisse of dark stuff that had been dyed twice and would not take the dye a 3rd time, the bonnet, the mended gloves, the half slice of bread from Wednesday, still folded in the handkerchief. She was at the servants' entrance of Harrowden House at 10 minutes past 9. Harrowden House stood on the north side of Grosvenor Square, a great pale-stoned house with tall windows and iron area railings and, above the front door, a stone escutcheon carved with the arms of the Marbury Dukes. Arabella looked at the front door only once, from the pavement at the far corner, and then she walked around the house to the mews side, where a narrow flight of stone steps went down to the tradesman's door, and she waited on the top step. The stone was cold through the thin soles of her bottines. She did not move. By 9:30, another woman had joined her on the step, then a third, then 2 more, then a cluster of 5 at once, all women, all clutching cards or small envelopes with a name upon them. Arabella had no card. She had only the little roll of the newspaper cutting in her glove, and beneath the glove the ink mark on her finger, and beneath that the composure that she had put on with the police. At 10 o'clock the door opened. Mrs. Pembroke stood in the doorway, small and thin and dressed head to foot in the black bombazine of a senior servant, a white apron over it as spotless as a communion cloth, a bunch of keys at her waist, a mourning brooch of jet at her collar. Her hair was white and drawn back so severely from her forehead that the skin at her temples showed pink. She wore round spectacles of thin gold wire. Her hands were the red hands of a woman who did not spare herself the scullery when the scullery needed a second pair. She looked at the row of women on the steps and above the steps, as one looks at a shelf of books whose spines one has read many times. "You will come in one at a time," she said. "You will not remove your bonnets in the passage. You will speak when spoken to. If Mrs. Pembroke says thank you, that is the end of the interview." She said this without any change of expression whatever, and then she nodded at the first woman on the step, a stout person in a bombazine of her own, and stood aside. Arabella was the 9th in the line. She waited on the same step for 2 hours. By 11, 3 had gone in and come out again with faces already pink at the ears. By 11:30, the number was 6. The rain began at 11:45, a fine cold rain that darkened the shoulders of a pelisse in seconds and settled invisibly on the brim of a bonnet. When Arabella's turn came, at 11:08, she stepped over the sill and into a stone passage that smelled faintly of beeswax and hyacinths. Mrs. Pembroke shut the door behind her. The rain noise stopped as if a lid had been pressed on the world. "Name," said Mrs. Pembroke. "Fairfax. Arabella Fairfax." Mrs. Pembroke's pencil paused over the paper for the length of a heartbeat, and then went on. She did not look up. "Character? I have no written character. You have come to the servants' door of Harrowden House to sit before a duke's housekeeper, and you have no written character. I have references of a sort. Miss Marlowe, formerly of the Miss Marlowe's Academy in Bath, who was my governess between my 9th year and my 17th. She is retired to Clifton. I have written her twice and had no reply, which I take to mean her health is very poor. I have also a letter from Reverend Ainsworth of St. Bartholomew's, Elmshaven, in Norfolk, who baptized me and taught me my Greek, and who was, until the winter of 1817, my father's closest friend. His letter is in my glove. I did not offer it as a written character, because it is a letter of condolence, and I do not think it would be honest to press a letter of condolence into that office." Mrs. Pembroke looked up. She looked at Arabella for a slow, unblinking count of 5. Then she pointed with the end of her pencil. "That door, not that one. Wait inside. Do not touch the books." The door indicated was of polished mahogany. Arabella turned the handle and went in. It was a small anteroom papered in pale green, with 2 straight chairs and a table on which stood a bowl of hyacinths in bloom. The scent of them, close, was almost too much. She sat down on the nearer of the 2 chairs. She folded her gloved hands in her lap. She did not touch the books, which stood in a low case against the wall, though her eye caught the gold letters on the spines without meaning to. Boswell, Gibbon, Cowper, an unbound folio Ovid that made her breath catch. She waited 9 minutes. Then the door across the anteroom opened, not the door she had come in by, and a footman in dark livery said, "This way, if you please, ma'am," and she rose and followed him. They went down a corridor of pale stone flags, past a service stair, through a green baize door, and out into the hall of the house proper. The hall of Harrowden House, seen from the tradesman's side, was not what a stranger might have expected. It was very high, and very cold, and very still. A great black and white marble floor ran from door to door. A staircase of pale wood curved up to the first landing and out of sight. On the walls, family portraits stood at wide intervals, each in a plain gilt frame, each lit by the gray window light and by nothing else. There were no flowers, there were no ornaments. The clock in the corner ticked slowly, a deep tick of old brass, and the sound of it went up into the emptiness and did not come back. The footman took her not up the stairs but along the hall to a door on the right, and he opened it, and he said, "Miss Fairfax, Mrs. Pembroke, ma'am," and he stepped aside. Mrs. Pembroke stood in a room lined floor to ceiling with books. Between the 2 tall windows a fire burned. 2 leather chairs faced each other across a low table. On the table lay a single volume, open, its pages downward. Arabella did not need to look to know what volume it was. The binding was the plain calf that the Grosvenor booksellers used for their editions of Ovid. "Sit," Mrs. Pembroke said. Arabella sat in the further chair. "You will not be interviewed by me," Mrs. Pembroke said. "You will be interviewed by another. He is not yet in the room. When he enters, you will not rise, you will not speak first. You will read what is put before you when you are asked to read it. You will not attempt to look at his face. Do you understand?" Arabella opened her mouth. "You will not answer that either, Miss Fairfax. Only nod." She nodded. "Very well." Mrs. Pembroke moved to the fire, took a small brass poker, laid one log across the others, set the poker back in its stand, and left the room by the door she had entered by. The door shut with the soft finality of a well-oiled hinge. Arabella sat alone before the fire. The clock in the hall struck the quarter, and the sound came through the wall like something remembered. She did not look at the books, though the books were on every side. She did not look at the fire. She looked at the volume on the low table, at its plain calf back, at the faint gilding of the letters along the spine, and she waited. Somewhere in the house a door closed. Somewhere else, a floorboard gave the small sigh of a floorboard that has been trod by the same foot at the same hour for many years. Then, in the passage beyond the further door, she heard the measured step of a man who walked with a stick. The step came nearer. It stopped at the door. It waited a beat, as if the man behind it were listening to the room. Then the handle turned. Arabella did not rise. She did not turn her head. She set her hands flat on her knees, and she kept her eyes on the volume on the low table, and in the small mean space between one breath and the next, she felt her heart do a thing it had not done since the morning of her father's funeral. It stumbled and then went on, quicker, as if it had remembered something without her permission. The door opened. She heard the tap of the stick on the marble threshold, and then the muted contact of the stick with carpet, and the tread of a heavy boot, and the whisper of a coat of fine wool, and the small dry sound of a gloved hand, laid briefly on the back of the leather chair opposite her own. He did not sit. He stood a moment behind the chair, and the fire showed her the edge of his sleeve, the black luster of a boot, the pale line of a cravat above the dark chest of a coat. She kept her eyes down. She could hear him breathing, quietly, evenly, as a swordsman breathes. "Miss Fairfax," he said. His voice was low, dry, unhurried. It was the voice of a man who had once given orders in a great deal of noise, and had learned that noise was rarely necessary. "Your Grace," she said. There was a small silence. In it she understood, with the clean clarity of a bell struck once, that she had answered him with a title he had not offered her, and that the title had come out of her mouth because she had known, from the first tap of the stick upon the marble, exactly whose house she sat in, and exactly who had entered the room. The gloved hand on the back of the chair lifted. "Sit forward," he said, "and take up the book." She reached across the low table. Her fingers, still gloved, closed on the plain calf spine. She turned the volume over in her lap and saw that the ribbon lay between two pages she knew by heart, and above the printed Latin, in the margin, someone had made, long ago, a small pencil mark shaped like a star. "Read," he said, "from the mark." And Arabella Fairfax, who had eaten half a slice of bread that morning and pawned a locket the day before, and had not, for 5 years, been asked by any person alive to read aloud from Ovid, laid the flat of her thumb along the star in the margin, and drew a breath, and began. The Latin came out of her steadier than she expected. She had feared her voice would tremble at the first syllable, betraying the empty stomach and the 2 hours in the rain, but the moment her thumb pressed the star in the margin, the room narrowed to the calfskin under her hand and the black print upon the page, and Ovid did what Ovid had always done for her since she was 9 years old in her father's library at Elmshaven. He carried her. She read the passage of Baucis and Philemon. She had not chosen it, he had. "Iamque per et terras, et quod pater aequor habebat, sparserat Aeolides Aeolus imbres." Her diction was small, careful, unhurried. She kept the vowels round, the consonants clean. She did not perform. She read as though someone had asked her the time and she were answering. Behind the opposite chair the Duke did not sit. He rested one gloved hand along the leather crest of the wing, and the other on the silver head of the ebony cane, and he inclined his head a degree, no more. The scar along his left jaw caught the gray window light and vanished again as he turned toward the sound of her. She read on. 6 lines. 10. She let the pentameter breathe. When she came to the description of the 2 old people, so poor that all they owned was one another, she felt the room listen. She did not look up. Stop. The word was quiet. It fell into the middle of a line and cut it clean. Arabella stopped. Her thumb rose from the page and hovered. Repeat the last line. She looked at the margin. She found her place. She read the line again. Cura pi dissunt, et qui coluere coluntur. Silence. The fire made its small sounds. Somewhere in the house, a door closed with a soft, well-oiled thud. Through the window, the sleet had thinned to rain, and the rain traced patient lines down the panes. Again. She read it again, the same intonation. She could not have altered it if she had tried. She did not know what he was listening for. The Duke's hand tightened on the leather. It was a small movement, nothing that Mrs. Pembroke would have noticed had she still been in the room, but Arabella noticed, because she had been trained since girlhood to notice the hands of men who would not tell her what they were feeling. Her father had been such a man. Halloway, she suspected, was such a man in a worse mode. The Duke walked 3 measured steps toward the window. The cane touched carpet, then the polished boards near the sash, then carpet again. He stopped with his back to her. His shoulders squared inside the charcoal gray coat, and he spoke to the glass. You have read Ovid before. Yes, Your Grace. Where? It was not asked as a question. He did not lift the syllable at the end. At home, Your Grace. My father taught me. Your father, Sir Henry Fairfax. The rain went on drawing its patient lines. He did not turn. Read the next 4 lines. She read them. She read them as she had read the others. When she reached the end, she stopped and waited, and set her thumb again upon the page in case he asked for more. He asked for no more. There was a garden, he said, at a house in Norfolk, a small garden with an espaliered pear against a south wall. In the summer of the year 1815, in the last week of July, or the 1st of August, I do not now remember which, I sat under an awning in that garden and drank very indifferent hock, and a girl of perhaps 17 sat on a stone bench with a book and read aloud to an old man who had asked her to. She read from Ovid. She read that same passage. I was not introduced to her. I had come with Lord Alaric Weston on Wednesday and was to leave on Friday, and by Friday morning I did not, in fact, remember her face. I remembered the voice. The room held its breath. Arabella found that she was holding hers. I remembered, he said, the way she paused before the caesura, not for effect, as though the line itself asked her to wait. I have heard that pause in this room this morning. He turned then. His face was toward hers, and the pale, still eyes were not upon her, precisely, but a little above her shoulder, and yet the effect was worse than being looked at, because it was the effect of being heard. Miss Fairfax, Your Grace. You are the daughter of Sir Henry Fairfax of Elmshaven. I am. He is dead. Since December of 1815, Your Grace, of a fever taken in the fen after his tenants. I am sorry to hear it. He said it as one who had been trained from a boy to say it, and meant it, as much as such a phrase can be meant by a man who had said it 1,000 times to widows and orphans of the regiment. But under the trained syllable there was a smaller sound, quicker, that Arabella did not fully understand. He knew her name, and it grieved him, and he did not choose to say why. She kept her back straight. She had held her back straight through the hours at the servants' entrance, and she would hold it now. Sit, he said. Your Grace, Mrs. Pembroke said I should not. Mrs. Pembroke is not the master of this house. Sit, Miss Fairfax. She sat. She had already been sitting. She meant, she realized, that she now permitted herself to lean against the cushion at her back, which she had not done before. He crossed to the second chair and lowered himself into it with an economy of movement that startled her. He did not grope. He knew where the arm of the chair was. He set the ebony cane against the leather within a hand's reach and did not fumble for the position. How long have you been in London? 2 years, Your Grace. Doing what? Copying music at first, for Mr. Chappell in Bond Street. When my eyes tired of the ledger lines I took in fair copies of legal papers for a clerk in Lincoln's Inn who paid by the sheet. I gave lessons in French and Italian to 2 little girls in Bloomsbury for 6 months, until the family removed to Cheltenham for the mother's health. Lately, I have read the Times to an elderly gentleman in Bedford Row 3 mornings a week. Why did you leave the elderly gentleman? He died, Your Grace, in January. He inclined his head 1/8 of an inch. And before London. After my father, I was some months with a cousin in Yorkshire. It was not a comfortable arrangement. I came south. Why not to the Reverend Ainsworth? She felt her fingers close upon the calfskin. She had not spoken the name. Mrs. Pembroke had not spoken it to him. He had, then, been told nothing before she entered the room, and yet he knew Elmshaven, and he had just, without preface, produced Ainsworth's name out of memory, as one draws a card from the middle of the pack. He wrote to me, she said. I did not go to him. He is a country clergyman with 3 children of his own, and a stipend of £90. I would not add to his burdens. You would rather starve in Bedford Street. He said it without cruelty. He said it as one who was noting a fact he had already deduced and wished her to confirm. I have not starved, Your Grace. Not yet. The fire cracked. She did not answer. He was silent a long moment. When he spoke again, it was as though he had set a small ledger aside and opened a larger one. I read every morning, Miss Fairfax, between 4 and 6 in the afternoon, not the newspapers. Those Pembroke reads to me at breakfast, which is a torment for us both. I mean books. Poetry, history, philosophy, in English, French, Latin, occasionally in Greek if the reader can be trusted with it. I sit here or in the small library upstairs. I do not require conversation. I require the text, in a voice that does not distort it. Do you understand? Yes, Your Grace. My last reader stayed 3 weeks. She read like a governess correcting a child. Before her was a young man of the parish, sent by my mother's chaplain, who read as if the book were a stage, and he a tragedian, much wronged by his manager. I have dispensed with both. Pembroke placed the advertisement without consulting me. I told her that if she did not find, in one Thursday, a person who could read Ovid without embellishment, I would engage no reader at all, and would spend my afternoons in the club, which she considers, for reasons of her own, worse than my being blind. Arabella almost smiled. She caught it at the corner of her mouth and did not let it go further. You may smile, Miss Fairfax. I cannot see it, and Pembroke is not here. She smiled. It was a small, brief thing. The terms, he said, are these. You will come to this house every afternoon from Monday to Saturday. You will arrive by 3, take tea in the housekeeper's room, and be at your chair by 4. You will leave at 6. Pembroke will provide a hackney home in wet weather and a footman to attend you as far as your door in any weather. I do not require you on Sundays. I do not require you at dinners or in company. You will be paid £90 a year, quarterly. Your first quarter will be advanced today, in full, in coin. She stopped smiling. She had begun to calculate at £90, and the calculation had turned into something else by coin. £90 a year was more than the elderly gentleman in Bedford Row had paid her in a year and a half combined. It was 3 times the widow's mite that Mrs. Hodge had let her scrape together to keep the attic. A quarter in advance was £22.10. £22.10 would redeem the locket, pay Mrs. Hodge to Michaelmas, and buy her a decent bonnet and a pair of gloves that were not yet dead. She kept her face still. That is very generous, Your Grace. It is not generous. It is the wage for the position. If you would prefer to be paid at the end of each quarter, as is customary, I shall not press you. I offer it at the beginning because your gloves are mended and your bonnet is soaked through, and you walked here rather than paying a fare, and if I am to hear you at 4 o'clock every afternoon, I would prefer you were not fainting into the Ovid. She had not thought that a man who could not see her would know the state of her gloves. She looked at her hands in her lap. The stitching at the fingertips was clean, but the leather was pale where it had been rubbed. Then she remembered that Pembroke would have described her, and that a butler had opened the door to her in the mews, and that the Duke did not need his eyes to know the shape of a woman with no fare. I shall be very glad of the advance, Your Grace. Good. He turned his head toward the door. Pembroke. She had not moved from the passage. Arabella heard the small metallic word of a key against a ring, and then Mrs. Pembroke was in the doorway, with her hands folded before her apron, and her face composed into the neutrality that housekeepers put on, as other women put on caps. Miss Fairfax will begin on Monday, the Duke said. 4 to 6. Advance her the first quarter now, in coin, from the estate box. She will need also a cab home this afternoon. And Pembroke. Your Grace. You will send Fletcher to Madame Verlaine in the morning with instructions to make Miss Fairfax 2 morning gowns of a plain but respectable stuff, and 1 for the evenings when I keep her late, and shoes appropriate to walking in London in March. The bill will be sent to me. Miss Fairfax will not see it. Arabella's mouth opened and closed. Mrs. Pembroke's eyes flicked once to her, once away. Your Grace. Miss Fairfax has scruples, the Duke said mildly. She wishes to say something about not being kept. Miss Fairfax. Your Grace, You will not be kept. You will be dressed as befits a woman I have hired to read Ovid in my library, and I will not have my staff whisper that the Duke of Harrowden's reader appears in the same fawn muslin every day. It is unkind to you. It is inconvenient to me. 2 gowns and a pair of shoes. That is not keeping. It is livery. Pembroke, that is all. Mrs. Pembroke inclined her head and withdrew. The door clicked. The rain thickened again against the panes. He turned his face back to Arabella. You will accept, Miss Fairfax. I shall accept, Your Grace. Good. Now read to me until the clock strikes 12. Whatever you like. Not Ovid. I have had Ovid. She looked down at the calfskin volume, at the star in the margin, and set it gently aside. Her hand hovered above the small stack of books on the table between the 2 chairs. Cowper, a volume of Boileau in French. Gibbon, 2nd volume. A worn copy of Sir Walter Scott's Marmion. Beneath them all, a slim octavo she did not recognize until she lifted it and read the spine. It was a school Virgil, foxed and thumbed, the boards loose at the hinges. She opened it and saw, on the flyleaf in a boy's careful hand, S. Marbury, Christ Church, 1804. She held it a moment. She thought of a boy of 19 with his name in a Latin book and no scar along his jaw and eyes that saw. Virgil, she said. Which? The Aeneid. Your school copy, I think, Your Grace. He was silent. Then, quite quietly, Book 4. She was surprised into looking up. He did not see her surprise. Book 4 was Dido. Book 4 was the queen who welcomed the stranger and loved him and was left. It was not a passage a man asked for casually. From where, Your Grace? From the beginning. She turned the leaves. She found the first line. She drew her breath, and she read, At Regina gravi iam dudum salcia cura, volnus alit venis, et caeco carpitur igni. He listened. He did not sit forward. He did not close his eyes. His eyes were what they were. He put his elbow on the arm of the chair and his forehead against the 2 knuckles of his right hand, and he listened, and Arabella read, and outside the rain slackened once more into sleet. She read for a quarter of an hour before he moved. When he did move, it was only to lift his head from his hand and to say, without opening his eyes, That is enough for today. Come back on Monday. She closed the book. Your Grace. Miss Fairfax. She rose. He rose. She began her curtsy, and then, remembering that he could not see it, she stopped, uncertain whether to complete it or say something. He solved it for her. You may curtsy, he said. If it steadies you. I shall not know whether you did or did not. Do as you please. She curtsied. It steadied her. She was at the door with the school Virgil laid neatly on the table when he spoke once more. Miss Fairfax. She turned. The passage this morning. Baucis and Philomene. Yes, Your Grace. Your father marked that star. Her hand tightened on the door. He did, Your Grace. I thought so. I remember his margin. He did not add anything to that. He did not need to. She stood a moment in the doorway with the reason for her being in that house, at last, entering her fully, that this cold, still, sightless man had known her father, had sat under his awning in Norfolk in the last summer of Sir Henry Fairfax's life, and had carried the sound of her voice 5 years through the smoke of 2 continents and the loss of his own sight, and had, when the advertisement came before him, waited to hear whether the voice would walk into the room again. She could not speak. She inclined her head. Monday, he said. 4 o'clock. Do not be late. I dislike being kept waiting, almost as much as I dislike Ovid recited by an amateur. Monday, Your Grace. She went out. Mrs. Pembroke was in the corridor with a small leather purse in her hand and a folded card, and behind her a footman with an umbrella and a rug over his arm. In the housekeeper's room, over a cup of hot tea sweet enough to sting, Arabella watched Mrs. Pembroke count out coins upon the deal table. Sovereigns. She had not seen a sovereign at close quarters in 3 years. Mrs. Pembroke counted 22, and then 2 half-sovereigns, and then a florin, and pushed the little heap toward her with the flat of her hand. £22.10, Mrs. Pembroke said. Sign here. Arabella signed. Her hand was steady on the page. The ink pot was of blue glass and older than she was. You will come Monday, Mrs. Pembroke said, and every day at 3, and you will go up the front steps, not the mews. His Grace was clear. His Grace was clear. Mrs. Pembroke did not look at her. She was busy with the purse strings. Mrs. Pembroke. Miss. When I gave my name at the door this morning, you paused. Mrs. Pembroke's hands stopped moving on the purse. She lifted her eyes over the rim of the round wire spectacles. I did. May I ask why? Mrs. Pembroke set the purse down. Miss Fairfax, she said, I was in service at Elmshaven from the year 1798 to the year 1804. I was under housemaid to your mother, God rest her, before I went to the Marburys. When she was married, she took her own woman, and I stayed on with the old Duchess. I knew your mother, miss, and I knew her hand at the pianoforte, and when a girl of your age walked into my hall this morning with her mother's camouflage at her throat and gave me the name Fairfax, I paused. If I had told His Grace before he heard your voice, he would have refused to hear you. He does not like to be prepared. He likes to know. Now he knows. Drink your tea. The cab is at the door. Arabella drank her tea. It burned her tongue, and she was grateful for the burn. She put the £22.10 in her reticule. She put her father's little card of appointment, Monday 4, beside the coins. She drew on her gloves. She did not put the bonnet back on until she was in the entry, because it was too wet to be worn indoors, and because Mrs. Pembroke, without asking, had taken it away to be dried, and given her instead a plain black one from a peg, with a note that it should be returned Monday, no thanks required. And Arabella had understood that in this house one accepted small kindnesses without ornament. The footman handed her into the cab. The cab was clean and warm. It smelled of old leather and pipe tobacco. The horse turned into Grosvenor Square at a walk, and Arabella sat back against the cushion, with her hands folded upon the small purse in her lap, and for the first time since the winter of 1815, she did not know what she felt. She felt many things. She could not name any of them. She thought of Bacchus and Philemon on their hill, and of 2 old people so poor that all they had was each other, and of the God who had come to their door dressed as a stranger, and had drunk their thin wine, and had known them for what they were. She thought of a girl of 17 on a stone bench in a Norfolk garden, reading aloud to her father, while a young officer she did not notice sat under an awning drinking indifferent hock. She thought of the officer at Waterloo 3 months later, in the smoke and the mud, and of the saber along the jaw, and the light going out of the eyes, and of the years afterward when he had sat in a dark room in Grosvenor Square, with no wife and no children and no book he could read, and of the moment when a housekeeper had brought him a folded advertisement out of the Times, and he had said, without knowing why he said it, "Advertise for a reader." She thought of her father in the fen in December, wet to the shoulder, working beside a cottager to move a cow out of a flooded ditch, and of the fever that had come 3 days later and had taken him in a week. She thought of the papers that had passed from Carriage to Halloway in the spring of the following year, and of a small draft of a letter she had never sent, and of the £90 a year that would let her write again, in a better ink, to a better solicitor, if she chose. She thought that she might choose. The cab turned into Bedford Street. She had never returned to it in a cab. She paid the driver from her old purse, not the new one, and she carried the new purse under her shawl up the 4 flights to the attic. Mrs. Hodge met her on the second landing, wiping her hands on her apron, and looked at her face, and looked at the shawl, and asked no question. "Mrs. Hodge," Arabella said, "I have taken a position in Grosvenor Square. I shall pay you to Michaelmas tonight, if it is convenient to you, and if you will have me for the 12-month, I should like the attic through to next March." Mrs. Hodge did not answer at once. She looked long at Arabella. Then she said, "Come down when you are ready, miss," and went back to her copper. Arabella climbed the last flight alone. She let herself into the cold attic and sat on the edge of the cot and unwrapped her mother's camafeu from the linen and pinned it at her throat, because it belonged at her throat, and because there was no one to see her pin it, and because from this Monday forward, when she pinned it in the mornings, she would be pinning it not against defeat, but against something else, and she did not yet have a name for what. She put the 22 pounds 10 upon the little deal table beside the Ovid of her mother. She looked at the small pile of gold for a long minute. Then she rose, and she took her cloak, and she went out into the last of the March afternoon, with a single sovereign in her hand, and turned her feet toward Long Acre. Mr. Ross knew her at once. He did not smile. He never smiled. He fetched the locket from the drawer under the counter, and set it on the velvet cloth between them, and named the redemption. She paid it. He wrote the receipt in a small crabbed hand, and pushed it across the wood. She folded the receipt into her glove and picked up the locket and held it in her closed palm all the way home. She did not open it in the street. She waited until she was again on the cot in the attic. She lifted the tiny catch with her thumbnail. Inside was a curl of her father's hair, going gray at the tips, wrapped in a scrap of paper on which he had written, in the hand she had learned to read by, "For my Bella, 12 years old, from her loving papa, 30 April 1810. The paper was worn where she had folded and unfolded it as a child. She refolded it now. She snapped the locket shut. She laid it beside the camafeu of her mother. Then she went to the little portfolio under the cot and drew out the rough draft of the letter she had never sent to Sir Edmund Halloway of Portman Square, and she read it through once, in the last grey of the daylight, and she did not tear it up. She folded it back into the portfolio. She would not send it tonight. She would not send it this week. But she would send it. She had, at last, an address to which any reply might come, and a duke behind her chair who could read a hand from Chancery Lane as easily as another man reads a bill of fare, and a full quarter's wage in coin upon her table, and Monday coming at 4. She lit the tallow. She read Ovid for an hour, by its yellow light, aloud, alone, to keep the voice in her mouth as he had heard it. When the wax guttered, she closed the book and sat in the dark, listening to the rain, and she thought of the pale, still eyes that did not see her, and had, nevertheless, seen her better than any man had seen her in 5 years. Monday, 4 o'clock. She did not sleep for a long while, and when she slept, she dreamt of a Norfolk garden under an awning in July, and of a stranger in a scarlet coat who had never spoken a word to her, and who now, 5 years later, from a chair in a dark London library, had at last leaned across the years and said her name. Monday came in with a wet wind off the Thames and a sky the color of pewter. Arabella walked from Bedford Street through the milling crowds of Long Acre and Bond Street, with the collar of her pelisse turned up and the cameo pinned inside the linen at her throat, where no one could see it. She had allowed herself a hackney the last quarter mile, because the pavements were slick, and because Mrs. Pembroke had said, "Front entrance," and one did not arrive at a duke's front entrance with mud to the ankle. She paid the driver and stepped down before the great stone portico at 10 minutes to 3. A footman she had not seen before opened the door before she had touched the bell. He bowed as if she had lived in the house all her life. "Miss Fairfax, His Grace expects you at 4. Mrs. Pembroke has ordered tea in the housekeeper's room." She followed him across the black and white hall. No dogs, no children, no music. Only the tick of a long-cased clock. Mrs. Pembroke was waiting for her in a small square room that smelled of dry lavender and beeswax. A brown teapot stood on a tray, and a plate with 2 thin slices of buttered bread. The housekeeper looked her up and down once and nodded. "You have not gone soft in a weekend," she said. "Good. Sit and eat. 4 o'clock comes quick." Arabella took the offered chair. She ate the bread, because she had learned in 2 winters not to refuse food. "Fletcher went to Madame Verlaine on Saturday," Mrs. Pembroke said, pouring. "2 morning gowns Thursday, an evening gown a week after. You need not go and be measured. She has your figure from a girl she dressed in Hanover Square, who is your size to the 1/4 inch. His Grace does not like fuss." "I am obliged," Arabella said carefully. "You are engaged," Mrs. Pembroke corrected. "There is no obligation in it. Tea will be poured for you at 3 every day. His Grace begins at 4. He will not remark upon your gown, so do not wear one that troubles you. Sit with your back to the west window. The light does not touch him there, and he prefers it so." She paused, holding the pot. And Miss Fairfax. He asks questions between passages. Answer them plain. He hears a hedge in a voice as I hear a lie. Arabella set down her cup. I will not lie to him. I did not say you would. The housekeeper's mouth almost softened. I said he hears one. The long-cased clock struck 4. Arabella went into the library alone. He was standing at the window this time, in profile, with one hand resting on the sash and the other on the head of the ebony cane. The scar along his jaw showed clean in the gray light. He did not turn. Miss Fairfax. Your Grace. Boileau today the French. You will find him on the low shelf, third from the fire. Read from the mark. She took the book down. The mark was a slip of card, an old visiting card from Paris with a name she did not know. She opened at the page and read, in French, from the middle of a satire, the lines about a man who mistakes his own vanity for public spirit. Her French was good. Her mother had insisted on it. She read for 20 minutes without interruption. He did not sit. When she paused at the end of a section, he said only, "Continue." At 4:30, he said, "Stop. Come to the second window." She hesitated, and then rose and went. She stood a careful 3 paces behind him. "Closer, Miss Fairfax. I am not going to eat you." She took 1 step nearer. "Describe the square to me," he said. "Do not tell me the name of every railing. Tell me what a stranger would notice first." She looked out. Rain drifted across the gardens. A nursery maid was hurrying a child under an umbrella. 2 chairs stood empty at a shut door. A knife grinder had propped his cart under the plane trees and was waiting for the shower to pass. "There is a knife grinder under the trees," she said. "He is patient. He has taken his cap off and put it on the stone by his feet, as if he means to sit through the rain. A child is being pulled home too fast. The nurse is more frightened of a wet ribbon than of the child crying. There are 2 chairs standing outside number 12. The door is shut, so someone has kept them waiting. That is all." There was a long silence. "You will do that for me every afternoon at 4:30, he said. 2 minutes, no more. You will not spare me the dull thing. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Your Grace." "Good. Return to Boileau." By the 5th week, they had a rhythm. She came at 3, ate her bread, and drank her tea in the housekeeper's room, and at 4, passed through the door with a fresh book and a still throat. He was sometimes at the window, sometimes in the far chair, once, only once, seated behind the great desk with a heap of letters spread beneath his hand that he could not read. He would name the book. She would find the mark. She would read. At 4:30, she would go to the second window and tell him, in 50 words or fewer, what stood in Grosvenor Square. Then Boileau or Gibbon or Ovid or Marmion again, until 6, when the clock in the hall struck and he said, "Enough." The gowns arrived on the Thursday. 2 of soft morning colors, dove and pale straw, cut in the imperial waist she was used to, with long sleeves buttoned at the wrist and small tuckers of muslin at the throat. She wore the dove one Monday. He did not remark upon it, but when she paused between books, he said, "Miss Fairfax, your voice sits lower today. You are less cold. Is the gown warmer?" "It is, Your Grace." "Good." That was all. She began to notice, in the 3rd week, that he had begun to ask her questions that were not about what she read. They came in like moths at a window, one at a time, and always at a moment when the last passage had gone well. "Your mother," he said one Wednesday, after Ovid, "she read Latin also." "She taught me, Your Grace, from my 7th year. And French, and Italian." French with her, Italian with a curate at Elmshaven who had been 6 years in Bologna. Fanelli. She looked up. "You knew him?" "I met him one summer. He translated a passage of Ariosto for us in the drawing room at Elmshaven. Your father laughed at the license he took." He paused. "You did not know I remembered." "I did not know you remembered even the house, Your Grace. I remember many things I have no use for." He held out a hand for the book. She rose and put it into his palm. His fingers closed on the spine. "Continue in the drawing room next Monday. Mrs. Pembroke will show you the way. The light there is kinder to your book." The drawing room was upstairs, at the front, with tall windows onto the square and a fire kept high. The chairs were placed nearer, one to the other, than in the library. She did not remark upon this. She sat where he indicated and read Marmion for an hour, and at 4:30 went to the window and told him a cabman had fallen asleep on his box. and a boy with a broom had made a fair path from the pavement to the gate. "How old is the boy?" "8 or 9, Your Grace." "Give him 6 pence when you leave. Fletcher will find one for you." She did as she was told. At the end of that week he sent her home with a small parcel. It was a copy of Cowper, plainly bound. On the flyleaf, in a hand she had not seen before but knew at once, someone had written, "For A.F. This is a decent edition. S.M." She sat on the edge of the cot in Bedford Street, with the book on her knee, and stared at the initials for a long time. She did not know whether to be moved or afraid. In the end, she opened the book at the mark and read the first 3 pages by candlelight, and understood that he had chosen the passage. Meanwhile, in his own study, at hours when she was in Covent Garden with the door bolted against the March damp, the Duke was making other arrangements. He sent for Mr. Graham Cotterell of Chancery Lane on a Tuesday. Cotterell came at once. He was a lean, tall man with a bald crown and half-moon glasses, and ink on 3 fingers of his right hand, and he had served the Marbury interest for 11 years without ever raising his voice. The Duke received him in the study with the door shut and Fletcher on the other side of it. "Sit down, Cotterell. I want a small thing done quietly, and I want it done by you and no one else." "Your Grace." There was a baronetcy in Norfolk. Fairfax of Elmshaven, Sir Henry Fairfax, died December of 15, of a fever, at 48, without a male heir. The estate passed under some arrangement to Sir Edmund Halloway of Portman Square. I want to know precisely what arrangement. I want the papers, the dates, the witnesses, the copies at Chancery Lane. I want the amount of the debt Halloway is said to have covered, and I want the name of the solicitor who was Sir Henry's own man before he died. Cotterell wrote in a small notebook. He did not lift his eyes. "Your Grace has an interest in the family?" "I have an interest in the truth. Sir Henry was a gentleman of my acquaintance. His daughter is in my employment. She has told me nothing of any of this. That, Cotterell, is why I need it done without noise." "Understood, Your Grace." The pen paused. "May I ask a plain question?" "You may." "If the arrangement is found to have been irregular, does Your Grace wish it undone, or does Your Grace wish it known?" "I wish it undone. I wish it undone so completely that when it is known, no man in a London club will lift a glass to Sir Edmund Halloway again." Cotterell closed the notebook. "Then I will begin with Carriage." The Duke's head lifted a fraction. Carriage was the man? Carriage of Chancery Lane. He died in the winter of 17. His clerks are still upstairs, above a chandler in Cursitor Street. The papers are in a room over their heads and nothing has been sold. I have known Willett, the elder clerk, 30 years. You have the whole matter half done already. No, Your Grace. I have the door. Behind it we shall see. Go. Cotterell rose, bowed, and went. In the hall he passed Arabella coming up from the housekeeper's room with her gloves in her hand. He inclined his head to her as to a lady he knew by report, and she returned the small bow with the careful courtesy of a woman who had not been introduced. They did not exchange a word. Neither knew, then, what the other would come to mean. That evening the Duke wrote a second letter, in his own hand, to Lord Alaric Weston, care of the White Hart at Melton Mowbray, where Weston was hunting. He wrote slowly, the paper held under a metal frame so that he might feel the edges of his lines, and Fletcher stood ready to guide the pen only if the ink ran to the margin. Weston, there was a house in Norfolk in July 15. Elmshaven, Sir Henry Fairfax our host. You had a chestnut mare that pulled to the near side. Your recollection of the young lady who read to the old vicar under the awning on the second afternoon. Her name, any detail. Yours in confidence, Marbury. He folded the letter, sealed it with the Harrowden signet, and gave it to Fletcher for the mail. No copy, Fletcher. No copy, Your Grace. The Duke sat a long moment after the man had gone. His hand rested on the edge of the desk. He had not asked Arabella. He would not ask her. He would build, quietly, the frame in which her name could be spoken again in a London ballroom without a whisper following it, and only when the frame was made would he tell her that he had touched it. This was not, he knew, the frankness a plain man owed a plain woman, but he had learned at Waterloo that some things must be arranged before they are announced, or they do not stand. In the drawing-room, at 4 the next afternoon, Arabella read Gibbon. She did not know that a letter with the Harrowden seal was already in a mail coach on the North Road, or that a lean man in half-moon glasses was climbing a narrow stair over a chandler's shop in Cursitor Street with a permission in his pocket that had not been asked. She only knew that the Duke's face, half turned to the fire, had lost, in 5 weeks, some small edge of iron. He listened now with his head slightly bowed rather than lifted, as if the reading were something to be sheltered rather than examined. She began to hear his voice in a different register too. On the first day he had used the crisp, dry tone of a man giving orders to a bailiff. By the 6th week he asked, sometimes in a voice barely above the fire, whether she was tired. He never used her Christian name. He never came within reach of her hand. But at the end of a passage he would sometimes say, "Once more, please." The line before the caesura. It is a beautiful line, and I have had it read badly to me for years. She would read it again. He would nod once. They would move on. On a Friday of the 6th week she found, on returning from her half-hour of tea in the housekeeper's room, a small square parcel on the reading chair. She looked at Mrs. Pembroke. "It is for you," said the housekeeper. "Open it now before he comes." Inside, on a bed of tissue, lay a pair of gray kid gloves, new, of the softest quality, with pearl buttons at the wrist. There was no card. Arabella stood a moment with the tissue in her fingers. "He noticed," she said, and her voice was steady only by an effort. "He cannot see them, and he noticed." "He heard the leather of the old ones split when you turned the page on Tuesday," said Mrs. Pembroke. "He does not miss much." Arabella wore the new gloves the following Monday and did not thank him, because he had not, in any obvious way, given them. He said, at the first pause, "Your hand is quieter today, Miss Fairfax. The paper does not tick." "No, Your Grace." "Good. Continue." There were other small altering things. On a Tuesday of the 4th week, in the middle of a passage from Gibbon on the sack of a Persian city, he lifted his hand. She stopped mid-sentence. "Miss Fairfax, there is a phrase your father used at table when a story ran too long. Do you recall it?" She sat very still. She could hear the clock on the mantel. He would say, "Enough of the walls, sir. Tell me who was inside them." The Duke's mouth moved. It was very nearly a smile. He turned it away from her, towards the fire. "Yes," he said. "That was it. Continue with the inhabitants, then, if Mr. Gibbon will permit." She continued. Her voice did not falter, but the line of her back, against the chair, softened by a fraction that a housekeeper coming in with the tea tray would have noticed, and did notice, and did not remark upon. On a Thursday of the 5th week he asked, out of nothing, "Do you sing?" "Not well, Your Grace." "That is a governess's answer. You sing enough to teach 2 little girls in Bloomsbury. Answer me plain." "I sing to keep a room warm, not for company." "Good," he said. "Neither do I. My mother sang for company. I have never forgiven a drawing-room for it since." He paused. "Have I offended you?" "No, Your Grace." "That is also a governess's answer." "You have not offended me," she said. "You have made me smile. I did not think you would." "Then continue with Marmion, Miss Fairfax, before you make a habit of it." She did, and when, at 6, the hall clock struck, and he said, "Enough," she rose and curtsied, and left the room without meeting his eye, because she had discovered, going down the stair, that she was smiling still. On the Saturday of that week he did a thing he had not done before. He rose from his chair, walked, with the cane, to the low shelf by the fire, and drew out a book himself. He did not need her to fetch it. He held it a moment in his hand, and then held it out into the air between them. "This one today, from the beginning. Do not tell me what it is." She took it. It was slim, calf-bound, well-worn. She opened it, and her breath caught. It was a small volume of the Italian pastoral of Tasso, and pressed inside the flyleaf, brown and paper-thin, was a bay-leaf. She recognized it. Her father had kept a copy of Tasso with a bay-leaf in it in the library at Elmshaven. He had brought it back from Naples in his youth. "Your Grace," she said, and stopped. "You know the book. I know a book very like it." "It is the same book," he said quietly. "Your father sent it to my mother in the winter of 14, when she was ill. He wrote a line inside. I have never had it read to me, because I have never known who to trust with the line." She turned to the flyleaf. In the same hand as the letter under her cot in Bedford Street, in the same brown ink, her father had written, "For the Duchess, in memory of a kinder Naples than the one we lately visited, H. Fairfax." She read the line aloud, in a voice that would have carried across an empty church. Then she turned the page and read Tasso, in Italian. for a full half-hour without pause. When she stopped, he did not say continue. He did not say anything for some time. He only stood at the window with his hand on the cane and his head slightly bowed. Then he said, "Thank you, Miss Fairfax. Put the book back exactly where I took it from." She put it back exactly. He did not touch the tasso again in her hearing. But that evening, when Fletcher came to close the shutters, the Duke said, without preface, "The little tasso on the third shelf. See that a small silk marker is put in it. Blue, if there is blue. Do not tell Miss Fairfax." "Very good, Your Grace." He probed further, always sideways, never head-on. On a Monday it was the name of the mare Sir Henry had ridden. On a Wednesday it was the pattern of the plate at Elmshaven. On a Friday, over a passage from Cowper about the death of a cousin, he said, without lifting his head, "There was a man who came often to your father's house, a neighbor. Halloway, was it?" She felt the room shift. She kept her voice level. "Sir Edmund Halloway of the Grange, 4 miles south. Yes, Your Grace. He came often in the last year." "He was of use to your father?" "He said he was." The Duke said nothing more. He did not press. He turned the conversation gently back to Cowper. But that night, in the study, he sent Fletcher for a fresh sheet of paper and dictated 3 lines to himself under his breath before he wrote them, and the lines went by the morning coach to Chancery Lane. Mrs. Pembroke saw more than she said. She saw that the Duke, who had for 2 years taken his dinner on a tray, had begun, in the 5th week, to have it laid at the small dining table instead. She saw that the fire in the drawing-room was made up an hour earlier than it need have been, so the room would be warm to the wall when a young woman came in cold from the hackney. She noted these things the way a housekeeper of 38 years' service notes a barometer, and kept the knowledge for the day when it would matter. She began, in those weeks, to sleep better. The garret in Bedford Street was still cold, and the tallow candle still smoked, and Mrs. Hodge's cat still yowled in the yard at 1 in the morning. But she had a coal in the grate now, and coffee in a canister on the shelf, and a small deal table on which she had set the Cowper and the mother's Ovid, and, in a pewter cup, a single early daffodil bought for a penny from a girl in the market. She had begun to eat a proper dinner. Her wrists had lost the sharp look of the winter. When she stood before the small square glass in the morning and pinned the cameo at her throat, she did not, any longer, do it as if arming for a battle she expected to lose. She wrote 1 letter that month. It was to the Reverend Ainsworth at St. Bartholomew's, Elmshaven. She did not tell him where she was employed. She told him only that she was in London, in health, and that if he could bring himself to write, at his convenience, a plain account of what he remembered of her father's affairs in the last year of his life, she would treasure it. She sealed the letter and paid the postage from her own purse and gave it to the boy at the post office in Henrietta Street with her own hand. The rough draft of a different letter, the one to Sir Edmund Halloway, still lay in the portfolio under the cot, unsent. She did not open it. She had begun to believe, without being able to say why, that she would not be the one to send it. Some other hand would speak first. She was right in this, though she could not have known how right. In Chancery Lane, on a wet Thursday, Mr. Cotterell sat in a narrow upstairs room over a chandler's shop with the elder clerk Willett, across a deal table and a japanned tin box open between them. The box had a paper label in a dead man's hand. It read, in faded ink, Fairfax of Elmshaven, to be held. Cotterell laid 3 papers side by side. He lifted his half-moon glasses to the bridge of his nose and studied the signatures. "Willett," he said at last, "look at the loop on the H of Henry." "I see it, sir." "Now look at the same loop on the deed of transfer to Sir Edmund Halloway." Willett looked. He was a slow man. He took his time. "Sir," he said, "that H was not written by the same hand." "No," said Cotterell. He closed the box carefully, as one closes the door of a sick room. "It was not." He carried the box to a locked cupboard at the back of the room and put it inside, and he pocketed the key. Then he took up his hat, went down the narrow stair into the wet street, and turned his face towards Grosvenor Square. He did not know that at that very hour, 3 streets away, a young woman in a dove-gray gown was standing at a window in a drawing-room and telling a blind man what she saw, in the plainest words she had, and that the blind man was listening as if her voice were the one instrument in a room full of tuned strings. He also did not know that on that same afternoon, in a milliner's on Bond Street, Lady Clarissa Vane had paused at a counter and heard, from behind a screen where two shopgirls were pinning a bonnet, the words, "Yes, Miss Fairfax, at Harrowden House. She goes at 3 every afternoon. The whole servants' hall is talking." Lady Clarissa had set down the length of ribbon she was holding, and asked the price, and paid, and walked out into the rain with her small mouth composed into its usual careful smile. In the carriage, with the door shut, she had said one word, aloud, to the empty seat opposite her. Fairfax. She had not spoken the name in 5 years. She spoke it now, the way a woman notes the return of a headache she thought she had cured. By the time Arabella left Grosvenor Square that evening in the plain hackney, the Duke insisted upon, and Cotterell was writing a note requesting an appointment with his Grace at his earliest convenience, and Lady Clarissa was folding a card of her own to be delivered to Sir Edmund Halloway at Portman Square before nightfall. The engine that would carry all of them to the same lit ballroom in Belgrave Square had begun, quite quietly, to turn. Arabella, coming into the garret at 7:30 with her new gloves in her hand and the smell of the March Street in her hair, knew nothing of any of it. She lit her candle. She set the kettle. She unpinned the cameo and laid it on the deal table beside the daffodil. She took down the cowper. She sat, and she opened it at the mark, and she read aloud to the empty room in the voice she had learned to make sit lower for him, and did not know that in 3 houses at once, in that same hour, her name had been spoken, and that each of the 3 speakers had meant something entirely different by it. The morning after was bright in a way that London seldom troubled to be in early May, and Cotterell was at the door of Harrowden House before the milk cart had turned out of Grosvenor Street. He gave his card to the footman, said only, "The Duke will see me," and was proved right within 4 minutes. Sebastian received him in the small study behind the library. He was standing at the mantel when Cotterell entered, one hand resting on the marble, the other loose at his side. The cane leaned against the leg of the desk. "You wrote urgent." "I wrote as I found, Your Grace." "Then find aloud." Cotterell laid his brown leather satchel on the desk with a care that had nothing to do with weight. He drew out 3 sheets folded together and 1 small pasteboard sleeve. He did not sit. "The Fairfax papers are intact," he said. "Willett has kept them in the room above the Chandler in Cursitor Street since Carriage died. The box is japanned, black, labeled in Sir Henry's own hand. Nothing has been sold, nothing has been signed over honestly. What has been done is worse. Say it plainly. The deed of transfer that carried Elmshaven and the Fairfax estate to Sir Edmund Halloway in the spring of 1816 carries a signature that is not Sir Henry's." Sebastian's hand did not leave the mantel. His face gave nothing to the room, and yet the room felt smaller. "How certain?" "I set 3 specimens beside it. A lease from 1812, a codicil from 1814, and a letter to Carriage dated the 11th of May in 1815. The letter is in the portfolio Sir Henry left, which I have not yet had in my hand, but of which Willett kept a fair copy. On all 3, the H of Henry is drawn from the top down in a single motion, and the tail of the Y falls short. On the deed of transfer, the H is closed at the top by a second stroke, and the Y curls back. It is not the same hand. Willett will swear to it. The scrivener at Doctors' Commons will confirm it. I have not yet touched Halloway. I did not think you would wish me to. You were correct not to touch him. There is more, Your Grace. The debt against which the property was assigned is a fiction. There is no promissory note behind it. There is a schedule of interest which begins 6 months before the loan is said to have been made. Whoever drew the schedule was clever, but not clever enough to know that Sir Henry paid tithe in November, and that his own steward would remember he was in Norfolk that week, and not in London signing anything. Sebastian took his hand from the mantel. He crossed to the window and stopped where the light was, though the light did nothing for him now. Who was the witness on the deed? A man named Fenn, clerk in Halloway's own employ. Dead of pneumonia last winter, which is inconvenient for the truth and convenient for Sir Edmund. The seal? Sir Henry's fob was on his person when he died. It came to Miss Fairfax with the rest of his effects. Someone else cut a passable copy. It is close, but the crest is a hair short in the wing of the griffin. The herald's office will know. For a moment there was no sound in the study but a coal shifting in the grate. Cotterell. Your Grace. You will do 3 things. You will keep the Fairfax box in Willett's hands and add to it, from tomorrow, 1 clerk of your own choosing to sit beside him. You will begin a discreet enquiry at the herald's office as to the seal. You will not, on any account, allow it to be known in the town that the papers are being examined. Sir Edmund is to sleep as he has slept for 4 years. And Miss Fairfax? Sebastian was silent long enough for Cotterell to think he had misheard the question. Miss Fairfax will be told nothing until I can put the whole into her hand, entire and irreversible. To tell her half is to injure her twice. Yes, Your Grace. There is a fourth thing. Your Grace. Draft a petition. Restoration of the Fairfax name and honors by Act of Parliament, on the ground of proven fraud. I do not want an ordinary judgment. I want a public instrument. Cotterell's pen was already halfway out of his pocket. He put it back. That will require your name, Your Grace, and Lord Halstead's, and Lord Bathurst if we can get him. You will have my name today. You will have Halstead by the end of the week. Bathurst is a matter of an hour and a bottle. Do not spare paper. No, Your Grace. Go by the back way. The maid is scrubbing the front step. Cotterell gathered his satchel. At the door he turned once. May I say, Your Grace, that the young lady's father was, in my recollection, a very decent gentleman. He was, said Sebastian, and I mean to have his daughter know it before the summer is out. Cotterell went. Sebastian remained at the window a long time. He did not lift the cane. He did not ring. Presently he crossed to the bookshelf, laid a finger along the spines by touch, and stopped at the small tasso with the blue ribbon Fletcher had tied for him. He drew it out. He held it a moment against his coat, as one holds a letter one has read, and then set it back exactly where it had been. At the same hour, in a smaller room 3 streets north, Lady Clarissa Vane was writing. The paper was cream, the pen was new, the seal wax was Portman Square red. She had not slept well. Whoever imagines an accomplished woman of 26 is unruffled by a name from the past, has never watched such a woman with her jaw set and her ring turned inward for company. Her Aunt Augusta came in with the chocolate tray and set it down without speaking. Augusta had learned that mornings were not for talking when Clarissa's pen moved like that. You are writing to Sir Edmund? I am. And what are you telling him? That we shall call at Harrowden House this afternoon at 3. Augusta set the chocolate pot down with a small clatter. Clarissa, one does not call on the Duke of Harrowden. He calls upon whom he pleases, and no one calls upon him. He will receive me. He receives no one else. He will not have the ill grace to refuse the daughter of his mother's oldest friend on a matter of family. There is no matter of family. There will be by 3. Augusta sat down slowly on the edge of the chaise. She was accustomed to her niece. She had been accustomed to her niece for a long time. She had not, however, seen her afraid before. Clarissa, what is this girl to you? Nothing. Then leave her be. I cannot. Because. Clarissa put the pen down. She folded the letter without blotting it, which was unlike her, and pressed the wax while the paper was still slightly damp, which showed. Because if it is that Fairfax aunt, then everything we have from Halloway sits on a rotten floor, and the floor has begun to creak. Augusta said nothing. She had known, in the way one knows the weather without asking the boy, that the arrangement with Sir Edmund was not to be looked at closely. She had accepted the carriage, the Vane pearls back out of Ranelagh's bank, the lease on the Bruton Street house, and the seat at the Duchess of Devonshire's supper. She had accepted a great many things. What do you propose to do? I propose, said Clarissa, to be the first to speak of her. If we call today, we make her small. If we wait, she grows. And Sir Edmund? Sir Edmund will come with us because he must, and because he does not yet know that he must, which is how I prefer him. She rang. She sent the letter. She dressed in the pink-figured muslin with the deeper rose spencer and the ostrich plume in her bonnet. Because there was no point being frightened and looking so, she was in the carriage at 2, at Portman Square at 10 past, and had Halloway beside her by 20 to 3, red in the face and complaining of the hour. 3 in the afternoon, Clarissa, it is not done. It will be done today. He has not received me these 2 years. He will receive us together. It is different. On what pretext? On the pretext that we call to inquire after his health, having heard he has taken a new companion into the household, and being family friends of long standing, we felt it right. Halloway looked at her sideways with the small brown-green eyes that had gone shrewd 20 years too late for anyone's good. A companion whom? A Miss Fairfax. He was silent for the length of Berkeley Square. When he spoke again, his voice had a different pitch in it. There cannot be more than one. There cannot. How came she there? That is what one calls to find out. They were set down at the front door of Harrowden House at 5 minutes to 3. Arabella, in the sitting room upstairs, was at that moment tying the strings of the pelisse she wore over the dove morning gown, and had just answered Mrs. Pembroke's knock. She had come down early. It was one of those days when the light off the square made her want to sit in the front room before he came in. Mrs. Pembroke opened the door of the sitting room and stopped. "Miss Fairfax, there is a lady and a gentleman below who ask to see his Grace. They have given their names as Sir Edmund Halloway and Lady Clarissa Vane." Arabella did not turn her head at once. The knot at her chin came undone under her fingers. She retied it. "He is not yet down." "No, miss. I have said as much. The lady says she will wait. The gentleman is already in the hall." There was a pause during which the two women looked at each other across the years of Elmshaven that lay between them without either saying the word aloud. "Mrs. Pembroke, miss, ask them to be shown into the yellow room and send for his Grace by his valet. Do not, if you can help it, tell them that I am in the house. They know, miss." "How?" "By the footman at the door, who is new." Arabella took the pelisse off. She laid it over the back of the chair. She sat down where the light was best and picked up the cowper, and opened it at random, and did not, in fact, read a word. Her hands were very still. The ink stain on her forefinger caught the light. Below stairs, Halloway had already been shown into the yellow room and had already begun to walk about it. Clarissa had followed at her own pace. She had not removed her gloves. She stood by the pier glass with her back to it and waited. Sebastian came down within 8 minutes. He did not use the cane. He had left it in the study by design because he did not choose to give Halloway the sound of it. He came down as a man comes down who has come down 1,000 times in the dark, and stopped at the threshold of the yellow room, and the room stopped with him. "Lady Clarissa, Sir Edmund." "Your Grace." Clarissa's meshera was of the correct depth for the second cousin of an earl calling upon a duke. "You are very kind to receive us at so unfashionable an hour." "I do not keep fashionable hours." "Sit, if it pleases you." She sat. Halloway remained standing. Sebastian did not sit. "You are well, your Grace." "I am as I am. We had heard, some in town, that you had taken a reader into the house." "You had heard correctly. A young person, they say, a gentlewoman. You may spare the circumlocution, Lady Clarissa. Her name is Miss Arabella Fairfax. She is the daughter of the late Sir Henry Fairfax of Elmshaven. She reads to me 6 afternoons a week, between the hours of 4 and 6. She is paid £90 a year and travels by hackney. I engaged her upon her application in answer to my own advertisement in the Times, having satisfied myself as to her voice, her Latin, and her character. Is there anything else you had come to inquire?" Clarissa did not falter. The ring on her left hand turned once. "How very fortunate, your Grace, to have found such a person. I was not without fortune before, but I take your point." Halloway, until then affecting to examine a small bronze on the mantel, turned and cleared his throat. The bronze went on standing where it had stood. "Your Grace, I feel it a duty of friendship to my late father's memory to say what I must say, though it costs me. The young woman is not, perhaps, what she seems. Her father's affairs at his death were of a nature I would rather not name in company. There were, unfortunate arrangements, debts. It was I who took upon myself the settlement of them, at considerable inconvenience to my own estate. The name has been under a cloud these 4 years. I speak only in your Grace's interest, that you may know into whose company you have been drawn." Sebastian did not move. His face, which had a well-earned reputation in 3 counties for giving nothing, gave nothing now. "Sir Edmund, you have said a great deal. Let me be sure I have heard it. You wish me to understand that Miss Fairfax's father died in debt to your estate, that the arrangements made in 1816 carried the Fairfax property to yourself in satisfaction of that debt, and that in consequence the daughter's name is one which a gentleman of my rank ought to hold at some distance. That, your Grace, is unhappily the whole of it. You are certain of the facts. I have the papers in my strong room, your Grace. I brought no copy today, not conceiving that the matter would arise. It has arisen. Your Grace, I only meant, you will have opportunity to produce the papers. I shall send my solicitor to your house at a time convenient to yourself within the week. He is Mr. Graham Cotterell of Lincoln's Inn. You may expect him." Holloway's color, which was already ruddy, deepened by a shade the room did not fail to register. "That is not necessary, Your Grace. A gentleman's word." "A gentleman's word will be quite sufficient, Sir Edmund, once it has been set beside his papers." Clarissa rose, because she had judged, with an accuracy her aunt would have envied, that the room was about to be lost by her partner, and might yet be saved by her. "Your Grace, we did not come to trouble you with business. We came to inquire after your health and to warn, as friends will, of a shadow on a name. If we have been mistaken, we shall be the first to rejoice. Perhaps you might do us the honor, when Miss Fairfax is at leisure, of allowing us to be presented to her? Old acquaintance is often the best assurance." "Miss Fairfax," said Sebastian, "is at present in the house. I shall not, however, present her to you today. She has her employment. When you are next at a house at which she may be met on equal footing, you will have your opportunity." Clarissa's smile did not move. It was, as the character sheet promised, a smile that had been practiced. "We shall not detain your Grace, Sir Edmund." "Lady Clarissa." Sebastian rang. Fletcher was already at the door, having been posted there since the 3rd minute of the call. He escorted them out with a bow of exactly the required inclination, and no more. The door of Harrowden House shut behind them at 17 minutes past 3. In the carriage, Clarissa did not speak until Grosvenor Street was behind them. Holloway had begun to bluster before the wheels had turned twice, and she let him bluster, which was one of the things about her. When he had finished, she said only, "He knows. He cannot know. There is nothing to know. He has already sent for the papers. He has already spoken the solicitor's name. He would not have done either had he not known enough to be sure of what he shall find. There is nothing to find, Clarissa." She turned her pale eyes on him for the first time that morning. "Sir Edmund, if there is nothing to find, then Cotterell will find nothing, and the matter dies. If there is something to find, then you and I are in the same carriage this afternoon, and shall not be in it long. I should like to know now which of the two it is." Holloway looked out of the window. He did not answer. It was answer enough. They were set down at Portman Square at 3:45. Clarissa went in with Holloway. She did not go home. She stayed until 7, and when she left with a plan. Upstairs at Harrowden House, at exactly 4:15, Sebastian entered the sitting room to find Arabella already in her chair, the Cowper closed on her lap, her hands folded on the book. "Miss Fairfax." "Your Grace." "You will not have been troubled by the callers. Mrs. Pembroke informed me they were here. I did not come down." "You were quite right." He crossed to his own chair and sat, and it was the first time he had sat before she began. "They asked to be presented to you. I refused." "Thank you, Your Grace." "I did not refuse for your comfort. I refused for their inconvenience. You will meet them, and soon. And when you do, you will meet them on ground of my choosing and not of theirs." She did not answer this. There was nothing for her to answer. "You have not asked what was said." "No, Your Grace." "You will not?" "No, Your Grace." He was quiet a moment. He was, as ever, listening for what she did not say. "You know, I think, more of what was said than you are prepared to tell me. I know enough of Sir Edmund to imagine most of it. Then know this. From this day the matter is mine. You will read as you have read. You will come at 3 and leave at 6. You will neither send nor receive letters upon the subject. If anyone should come to you in the street, in your own lodging, at the door of this house, or elsewhere, and speak your father's name to you in a manner that displeases you, you will tell me, and only me, and by the next morning that person will not speak so to you again. Do I make myself understood?" "You do, Your Grace." "Read." She opened the Cowper. Her voice was, if anything, steadier than it had been the day before. He listened with his hand at his temple as he did when he wished to be very sure of a line. When at 4:30 the clock on the mantel chimed, he did not ask her to go to the window. He said only, "Continue," and she did. At 6 she rose. He rose with her. It was the first time he had risen with her. "Fletcher will hand you into the hackney. Mrs. Pembroke will see you at the door. Go home. Eat well. Sleep." "Yes, Your Grace." At the door of the sitting room she turned back. "Your Grace." "Yes." "My father, in his last year, believed a great many things of Sir Edmund that others found convenient to disbelieve for him. "I do not disbelieve them, Miss Fairfax." "Thank you." She went. Sebastian stayed a moment where he was. Then he sat and rang and had Fletcher fetch him paper and pen. He wrote 3 letters. The first was to Cotterell, 1 line. "You will have Halloway's papers by Saturday." The second was to Lord Halstead, 2 lines. The third was longer and slower, and went by the evening mail to the White Hart in Melton Mowbray. He did not open with Weston's name. He opened with the words, "You will remember, in the summer of the year 15, a hot afternoon in a village called Elmshaven, and a girl of 17 reading to an old man under an awning. I need you to remember it aloud, and to a lawyer, and within the fortnight." He sealed with the Harrowden signet. He gave the letter to Fletcher himself. "By the night mail, not the morning. Your Grace." Fletcher went out. Sebastian sat with his hand still on the desk where the wax had cooled. He thought, without moving, of the sound of Arabella's voice reading Cowper, and of the sound of Halloway clearing his throat before a lie, and of the smell of a Norfolk garden in July, and it was for him one continuous sound with 3 different lengths. Weston's answer came back by return of the mail, which was to say Wednesday evening. It was written from the White Hart, on paper that smelt of the parlor there, and it said, in a hand that ran a little because Weston had been at his second glass, "Marbury, I remember it as if it were the week before last. It was the 28th of July, a Wednesday. Fairfax's vicar had come to dinner and stayed the night for the heat. His daughter read to him in the arbor under the yew because he could not bear the sun on his forehead. She was in a white gown. She read Ovid, Baucis and Philemon, I would swear to it, in Latin, and then in English for the vicar who had lost his Latin along with his teeth. Her voice was already the voice you told me not to forget. I did not forget it either. I will come up to town by the end of next week and swear to what I have said before any man of the law you name. Yours, Weston." Sebastian, when Fletcher read it to him, said only, "Good," and had the letter locked in the desk with Cotterell's report. By Friday of that same week, Cotterell had Halloway's papers. He had them not by Halloway's leave, for Halloway had contrived to be at Newmarket, but by Willett, who had been an elder clerk for 30 years, and knew that a man who leaves town in a hurry with 3 days' notice leaves his second-best safe half-locked. Cotterell would not have countenanced burglary. He had not needed to. The papers were in the possession of the deputy at Portman Square, who was a nephew of Willett's wife's sister, and the deputy handed them across for an afternoon on the strength of the family. They were back in the safe by evening. Cotterell had, by then, his notes. He came to Harrowden House at 9 on Saturday morning. Sebastian was already dressed. "Well, every worse than I said, Your Grace. The schedule of interest is drawn on paper, watermarked 1816. The debt is dated 1815. The witness on the deed has been dead 2 years. The seal is a copy, and a poor one, of the Fairfax fob, and Halloway's own steward, a man named Corbin, whom I have taken the liberty of speaking with in confidence, recalls that Sir Henry was at Elmshaven the whole of the November, in which the loan is said to have been executed in London. You have Corbin. I have his letter. And Weston? Weston will be in town Thursday next. Then we have, by Thursday of next week, everything we need to break Sir Edmund in half, and everything we need to lay before Parliament to make the girl's name whole. Cotterell. Your Grace. You will draft the petition tonight. You will bring it Monday. You will not, on any account, allow any word of this to travel a foot beyond this room, Weston, Willett, Corbin, and Halstead, until I have laid it in Miss Fairfax's hand. Do I make myself clear? You do, Your Grace. Go by the back. Cotterell went. Sebastian sat some time after. Then he rose and went himself, without cane, along the corridor to the small drawing-room upstairs, which had for 6 weeks been Arabella's room in all but name. It was empty. The chair was where she had left it. On the little table beside it, in a glass she had asked for on Wednesday, was a single sprig of lily, of the valley she had brought that morning from a girl in Grosvenor Street. It smelt of the country. He stood in the doorway a long moment. He did not enter. At 10 minutes to 3 that afternoon he was back in the study when Fletcher brought a card. A gentleman for Your Grace, not upon our list. Read the name. Reverend Josiah Ainsworth, of Elmshaven. Sebastian's hand closed on the arm of the chair. "Show him up and send at once to Bedford Street for Miss Fairfax. Say that His Grace has asked her to come an hour early, and that a carriage waits at the door." "Your Grace." Fletcher went out. Sebastian, alone, said quietly to the empty room, as if to warn it, "It begins." The Reverend Josiah Ainsworth came up the stair with his hat still in his hand, as if he had forgotten to give it to the footman. He was a small man past 60, in a black coat gone brown at the elbows, and he stopped at the study door and waited to be spoken to. "Come in, sir," Sebastian said. "Sit where the fire is." Ainsworth sat. He set the hat upon his knees and pressed both palms flat over the crown. "Your Grace," he said, "I did not answer her letter by post because there are matters I could not put on paper and take a mail coach through 3 counties." "Then put them here." The clergyman drew breath. In the last year of Sir Henry's life, Sir Edmund Halloway rode over from the Grange 3 or 4 times a week. He came at hours when Sir Henry was fevered. He brought a decanter. He brought papers. Once he brought a witness whose name Sir Henry could not later recall. Sebastian's hand did not leave the arm of the chair. "Go on." "I sat with Sir Henry the last week. He said to me, more than once, that he had put his name to nothing he had read entire. He said Halloway had told him it was a codicil concerning the copse at the North Field. He said afterwards he could not find the codicil, only a schedule of moneys he had never seen counted. You are willing to swear this? Before God and before any court in England." Sebastian rose then and went to the window and turned back. "You will lodge in this house tonight and every night until we have done. You will not go abroad in London. Fletcher will bring paper and ink to your room. Write it plain, sir. Names, dates, hours. Every visit Halloway paid, every witness, every glass poured. I have kept a diary, your Grace." Ainsworth touched the breast of his coat. "It is here." Sebastian's mouth moved once, briefly, as near a smile as it went in these weeks. "Then we shall want 3 fair copies of it by Monday." A knock. Fletcher, at the door. "The carriage is at Bedford Street, your Grace. Miss Fairfax will be here within the hour. Take Mr. Ainsworth to the green room. Give him whatever he requires." The clergyman rose. At the door he turned. "Your Grace, she does not know I have come?" "She will." Alone again, Sebastian went to the desk and stood a long while, with his hand on the leather blotter. When Cotterell's petticoat lay drafted upon that blotter on Monday, and Weston's sworn recollection lay under it on Thursday, and Ainsworth's diary lay under both by Friday, Halloway would sleep his last untroubled night. He did not permit himself, even alone, to imagine the moment further. It was too dear. The carriage came into Grosvenor Square at 4:10. Arabella stepped down before Fletcher had quite handed her, and stood in the road a moment, looking at the door of the house as she had never yet looked at it, for she had been sent for early, and she did not know why. Mrs. Pembroke met her in the hall. "There is a gentleman upstairs to see you, my dear." "Who?" "Your father's friend from Elmshaven." Arabella's hand went to the cameo at her throat. She said nothing. She let Mrs. Pembroke take her pelisse, and she walked up the stair with the housekeeper's steady tread behind her. Ainsworth stood as she came in. He was smaller than she remembered, or she was taller than the child he had blessed at 10. He looked at her a moment, and then he said, "My dear." She sat because she could not stand. "You came yourself." "I could not write it." "And then His Grace's carriage was in the lane at Elmshaven yesterday morning at 9, sent for me. I have been on the road since." He paused. "I owed your father a hard errand. It has been late." "Tell me." He told her, evenly, of the last weeks in the fever room, of the visits, of the papers Sir Henry could not later find. She listened with her hands folded and her eyes upon the carpet. When he had done, she said only, "He knew. He suspected. He was too ill to prove." "And you kept the diary?" "From the first Sunday I felt the wrong, yes." She did not weep. She sat forward a little and asked, "Is he here in this house tonight?" "By His Grace's order, until we are done." "Good," she said. "Do not leave him." The door opened. Sebastian came in without the stick, quiet in his own house as he had learned to be. He did not speak. He stood inside the door and let them finish being what they were to each other, which was almost family. Then he said, "Miss Fairfax, will you read to me an hour before you go?" She rose. "Yes, your Grace." Ainsworth withdrew to the green room. In the upstairs sitting room, the lily of the valley had wilted. A fresh sprig had been put in its place by some quiet hand. Arabella took the cowper because she trusted it, and she read for an hour without missing a syllable. Sebastian sat, not opposite, but at the same low table, closer than he had ever sat before, and listened as a man listens who is holding something in his mouth he will not yet speak. At 6, he said, "You will not be told the particulars until they are put in your hand as a finished thing. It is not distrust. It is that I will not have you carry weight before I can lay it down for you. I understand. There will be a party at Belgrave Square, at the Countess of Marden's, on Thursday next. A rout, 200 people. Fletcher will bring a gown to you on Wednesday. You will wear it, and you will go, and you will let yourself be seen. That is all I ask of that evening." She looked up. "Your Grace, there will be talk. There is always talk. I would rather it happen where I have arranged the ground. I shall go." He inclined his head. She left with Fletcher in the hackney. The house closed behind her. Between that Saturday and the Wednesday of the following week, matters moved as Sebastian had ordered them to move. Cotterell delivered the petticoat at 10 on Monday morning. Lord Halstead set his name to it before noon and undertook to bring Bathurst by Friday. Weston came down from Melton Mowbray on Thursday afternoon and swore, before a notary in Lincoln's Inn, to the Wednesday of July the 28th, 1815, and to the girl in the arbor, reading Ovid to the toothless Vigario, and to the memory of a father proud in that hour and dead by December. Ainsworth wrote out his diary in 3 fair copies with a clerk beside him, and slept in the green room, and did not go abroad. Willett, in the room over the chandler in Cursitor Street, added a second clerk of Cotterell's own to the watch upon the japanned box. Corbin at Elmshaven kept his silence in his own kitchen, waiting to be sent for. Halloway came back from Newmarket on the Tuesday, went at once to Portman Square, found nothing amiss in his house, and slept, as Sebastian had wished him to sleep, well. Clarissa Vane did not sleep well. She sat late in Bruton Street with her aunt on the Sunday and the Monday and the Tuesday, and by the Wednesday she had made her plan and had put it into the reticule she meant to carry to the Countess of Marden's rout, a small bright object folded twice in tissue, and she smiled at herself in the glass, and thought that a woman who could take a barony back from the bank could take a governess out of a duke's house. On Wednesday afternoon, Fletcher came to Bedford Street with a box. Mrs. Hodge received it in the parlor and blessed herself once. Arabella carried it up 4 flights and set it on the cot, and stood a moment before she opened it, as one stands before a letter that will change a house. The paper folded back. Beneath the paper lay silk of a blue so deep it looked, in that garret light, like a piece cut out of a night sky over Norfolk. Empire waist, long sleeves cut to fall from the shoulder like water, a modest bodice, no ornament. Long gloves of cream satin folded neat beside it, a pair of slippers dyed to the gown, a comb of small seed pearls set in silver. At the bottom of the box, on a card, in a hand she had seen only twice before but would know among 1,000, "A la belle Miss Fairfax. Wear the cameo, S.M." She held the card a long minute. Then she folded the tissue back over the silk, closed the lid, and went down to Mrs. Hodge to ask if she might have the loan of the parlor glass on the Thursday afternoon. Thursday came gray and warm. Fletcher was at the door at 7 in the evening with the ducal carriage. Arabella came down the 4 flights in silk that made Mrs. Hodge sit down upon the stair. The cameo of ivory, with its little crack behind, was pinned at the modest bodice, over the heart, where Sebastian could not see it, and where she knew he would know it was. At Harrowden House she was taken into the small drawing-room. Sebastian was there, in evening dress, the star of an order at his coat. He turned toward the door at the sound of her step. "Miss Fairfax." "Your Grace." "You have the cameo?" "I have it." "Good." He held out his hand for hers, briefly, the barest touch to place her arm in his. "You will do very well. Speak little. If you are addressed, name yourself plainly. Do not defend anything. I will not be far." They went out to the carriage together, and by 9:30 were set down at the awning in Belgrave Square, and the crowd on the pavement moved apart for the arms upon the ducal panel as crowds do. The Countess of Marden's house was blazing with wax. 200 people, said the papers afterwards, though it may have been closer to 180. The stair was lined with hothouse lilies. Music went in the further room. The hall smelled of orange and beeswax, and the perfume of a great many women in one place. Sebastian took the stair on Fletcher's arm. Arabella walked a half-pace behind and to his right, as instructed, and did not look up until they were upon the landing, and the major domo had said, from the drawing-room door, "The Duke of Harrowden, Miss Fairfax." The room did not fall silent. It slowed. Fans that had been moving moved a little less. Faces that had been turned toward one another turned. Arabella felt the eyes upon her as a physical weight upon the shoulders, and did not stoop under it. She heard, somewhere near the fireplace, a man say quietly to another, "That is the girl he reads with." Lady Marden came forward. She was a woman of 60 with white hair and shrewd eyes, and she took Arabella's hand in both of hers. "My dear," she said, loud enough to be heard 4 yards off, "your father dined at this house in the year I was married. You are very welcome. Cheger?" It was a shield, given openly, and Arabella knew it. She curtsied. Lady Marden turned then to Sebastian and gave him her arm, and led them both into the room. They were half an hour in the drawing-room. Arabella spoke to Lady Marden's daughter, a girl of 19 with a stammer, and to an old admiral who had known the North Norfolk coast, and to a bishop's wife who spoke of the cathedral at Norwich. She kept her voice low and her answers short. Sebastian was never more than a few paces off, though he stood turned always in a different direction, and she understood that this too was arranged. Lady Clarissa Vane came in on Sir Edmund Halloway's arm at 10:15. Clarissa wore pale yellow satin cut low across the shoulders and a rope of pearls that had once been in the bank. Halloway wore his burgundy coat and his little embroidered waistcoat, and had drunk enough at his own house before coming to give his face the shine that his enemies had learned to watch for. They made their tour of the room. They stopped at the fire. Clarissa's eyes went once across the room to where Arabella stood beside the pianoforte, and then away. At 11 the crowd thickened for supper. The rooms grew close. Ladies set down their reticules upon the small tables between the sofas, as ladies did in such crushes, and moved from group to group. Arabella set hers down upon the marquetry table beside the window, near a pair of urns. 10 minutes later, Clarissa passed that table, on the way to the supper room, with her Aunt Augusta at her elbow. Aunt Augusta stopped an old friend at the very moment Clarissa's hand went out to steady herself upon the marquetry. The hand rested there perhaps 3 seconds. Then Clarissa moved on. At 11:30, Lady Marden's own reticule, upon the sofa in the further drawing-room, was found to be open, and a small case within it, and the case empty. It was a case that had held, said Lady Marden with real anger, an emerald brooch that had been her mother's, worth £600 and worth 10 times as much to her. The rooms were closed. The doors were kept. 2 footmen stood at the head of the stair, and 2 at the foot. Lady Marden, white about the mouth, apologized to her guests and asked, if they would permit it, that reticules be brought out and set upon the long table in the hall, and that the ladies stand by them, and that a search be made in her presence and in the presence of the Countess of Marden's own woman, that no honest guest be under any shadow when she went home. The company made the noises company makes at such a moment. Some laughed, some colored, some said at once, of course. A young matron near the door said in a carrying voice that she thought it monstrous. Lady Marden, who had governed such houses 40 years, made no answer and did not look at her. The reticules came to the long table one by one. Arabella carried hers as she carried the cameo. She set it beside the others and stepped back a pace and folded her hands. Clarissa's reticule was searched. It held a fan, a handkerchief, a card case, a small vial of salts, and a pair of silver bonbonnières. It held no brooch. Lady Marden's own woman took up Arabella's next, because it was next in the line upon the table, and opened it, and put in a practiced hand, and drew out, folded twice in a scrap of tissue, a brooch of emeralds set in gold in the shape of a laurel wreath. That Lady Marden knew at once from her own hand as her mother's. The woman held it up. She did not speak. Lady Marden did not speak. The company drew in one breath at the same time and did not, for the length of that breath, let it out again. Halloway's voice came from beside the pianoforte, clear enough to reach the hall. I regret to say I am not surprised. The heads turned to him. Some months since, he went on, in the tone of a man who has practiced, certain small articles were lost from my own house at Portman Square, upon an occasion when a young person of straitened means was present as a governess to my ward. The matter was hushed for the sake of her family, which was once known to mine. It appears I was too indulgent. I ought to have spoken. He looked, then, straight at Arabella. Clarissa did not look at her. Clarissa was looking at Lady Marden with a face composed of exactly the correct measure of sorrow. "Miss Fairfax," Clarissa said, low, as if pained, "for the sake of what once your family was, I beg you say something." Arabella did not answer at once. She was looking at the brooch, at the tissue, at the way the tissue was folded. She was looking too at her own reticule, and at the small silver clasp upon it, and at the placing of the tables. She saw, in the space of perhaps 3 seconds, the whole arrangement plain, and knew who had made it, and when, and how. She could have named it aloud. She chose not to. She was aware, as one is aware of one thing in a room of many, that Sebastian was standing in the doorway of the drawing-room, quite still, his head slightly turned so that his ear inclined toward the hall. She was aware that Fletcher was at his elbow. She was aware of Ainsworth, whom she had not known to be present, standing at the far side of the hall, with his hat still in his hand, as if he had come straight from the coach, which he had. She was aware that behind her, at the foot of the stair, Mr. Cotterell had come in without cloak or announcement in a plain black coat, and that a second gentleman stood beside him, whom she did not know but who wore court dress. Weston, though she did not know it yet, Lord Halstead beside him. She understood, in the same 3 seconds, that Sebastian had put every piece upon this floor before her, and had asked only one thing of her: be seen. She lifted her chin. She did not raise her voice. She spoke into a room that had gone entirely quiet, and she said only, plainly, without ornament, "My name is Arabella Fairfax. I am the daughter of Sir Henry Fairfax of Elmshaven, in the county of Norfolk. I have taken nothing from any house in London, tonight or upon any night. I say this once. I will not say it again." She did not defend. She did not accuse. She named herself, as he had told her to, and she stopped. For a heartbeat the room did not move. Holloway drew breath to speak again, and did not, because Clarissa's hand had closed upon his sleeve. And then a step sounded in the drawing-room doorway. It was not hurried. It came evenly, with the slight pause of a man who is counting the distance in his head. The company parted for it, as company parts for a great house it does not yet dare to interpret. Sebastian did not carry the stick. He walked into the hall on the sound of her voice alone, as he had walked once before from his study to the yellow room without it, and he crossed the length of the marble as if the marble had been laid down for him. Fletcher did not touch him. Sebastian's fingers found, with no fumbling and no fault, the inside of Arabella's elbow, and rested there. He said quietly, to the room, "Miss Fairfax speaks the truth." He said nothing else. He did not turn toward Holloway. He did not name Clarissa. He stood at Arabella's elbow, in evening dress, with the star of his order upon his coat and his eyes fixed upon nothing, and by the fact of standing there, he made it impossible for any voice in the room to speak next except by his leave. Lady Marden knew her business. She said, into the silence, "Your Grace. Madam, if you will forgive an intrusion upon your house, which is the last thing I intended when I brought Miss Fairfax to your door, I will ask leave to speak a word further before the search is continued." "You have my leave, sir." "Then, madam, and with your permission, I will ask that no lady's reticule be opened until Sir Edmund Holloway will be so good as to explain, in this company, why the seal upon a certain instrument, bearing the name of Fairfax, bears a griffin, whose wing is short by half an inch of the true Fairfax griffin, now on record at the Herald's office. Mr. Cotterell of Lincoln's Inn has the instrument. Lord Alaric Weston has other matter to speak to. The Reverend Mr. Ainsworth of Elmshaven, who is at the far door, has yet a third. I would not, madam, willingly darken your evening, but an accusation has been made in your hall, and I will not have it stand upon the floor a minute longer than it must." Cotterell was already coming forward at the word of his name. Weston came with him. Halstead, in court dress, took a half pace and no more. Holloway had gone the color of tallow. He said, thickly, This is a private matter, your Grace, and hardly—" "It became public," Sebastian said, "when Miss Fairfax was asked in this hall to answer a public charge. It is now, sir, precisely as public as you have made it." Clarissa's hand was still upon Holloway's sleeve. Her face had not moved. Her eyes had moved once, to the far door, and had found Ainsworth, and had understood him. She spoke then, calmly, in the voice she used at supper. "Your Grace, we are among friends. Surely it is no proper hour for solicitors." "Cousin," Sebastian said, though she was no cousin of his and only remotely a connection of his mother's, "you and I will speak before I leave this house. That is not for the present company." Lady Marden looked from one to another. She said, "The supper rooms will remain closed. My guests will oblige me by staying where they stand. Your Grace, will you speak?" Sebastian did not move his hand from Arabella's elbow. He said, "Not I, madam. Mr. Cotterell, if you will be so good." Cotterell opened his pasta of leather and drew out a folded paper. Arabella, who had not moved, felt the light pressure of Sebastian's fingers at her arm, and understood that this was the moment she had been asked to stand still for, and that all she had to do to be at the bottom of the well was to stand there and be seen. She stood there. She looked at the little sprig of emeralds that lay upon the tissue upon the table, and at the woman who had put it there, and at the man whose voice had come across the hall to name her true. Beyond the arch, in the further drawing-room, some hand had begun to lift a candelabrum, and the light rose upon the ceiling and fell again. Holloway's mouth opened and made no sound. The clock upon the mantel struck the quarter before midnight. Cotterell unfolded the paper. He held it up to the candle so that the writing might be seen. And upon that folded paper, in the hall of the Countess of Marden's house in Belgrave Square, with 200 faces turned to it, and Arabella Fairfax standing under the hand of the Duke of Harrowden, the bottom of the well opened, and, in opening, showed its floor. Cotterell lifted the candle a little higher and, in a voice that had spent 30 years in courtrooms and had never once been raised in one, began to read. An instrument dated the 17th of November, in the year 1815, a loan of £4,000 from Sir Edmund Halloway of Portman Square to Sir Henry Fairfax of Elmshaven, in the county of Norfolk, secured against the estate and its rents, witnessed by one Josiah Fenn, clerk, now deceased, and sealed with the arms Fairfax. He paused only long enough for the room to hold its breath. Upon examination, 3 matters. The paper on which the schedule of interest is drawn bears the maker's mark of 1816, though the debt is dated 1815. The seal impressed beneath the signature shows the wing of the Fairfax griffin shortened by half an inch from its true engraving, of which the Herald's office holds the master, and the hand that wrote the letter H at the head of the name Henry did not write the letter Y at its foot. I hold, for the comparison of any gentleman in this room, 3 authentic signatures of the late Sir Henry Fairfax, taken from a lease of 1812, a codicil of 1814, and a letter to his solicitor, Mr. Carriage, dated the 11th of May, 1815. He laid the 4 papers upon the long table in the hall, side by side, and stepped back 1 pace. Nobody moved. 200 candles burned unregarded along the walls. Lord Halsted came forward first, in his court dress, and bent his grey head above the papers. He looked twice. He straightened, faced Lady Marden, and said only, "It is as Mr. Cotterell states." Lord Bathurst, arriving late in the doorway and wholly unbriefed, saw enough in Halsted's face to remove his hat. Then Weston stepped from behind Cotterell, his ruddy hair catching the light of the sconces, his voice pitched not for a drawing-room, but for a regiment. On the 28th of July, in the year 1815, being a Wednesday, I sat with the Duke of Harrowden upon the west terrace of Elmshaven in Norfolk, as guests of Sir Henry Fairfax, whom I esteemed a man of honour. I swear to this at Lincoln's Inn on Thursday last, before Mr. Peabody, notary, and I swear to it here. He inclined his head to the Countess. There was that afternoon a girl of 17 reading Ovid to an old clergyman under an arbour of yew. It was the same voice which spoke, 5 minutes ago, in this hall. A murmur ran the length of the room and died. The Reverend Josiah Ainsworth came next, hat pressed against his coat, plain and grey and quite unafraid. He held a small book bound in black cloth. "I was rector of St. Bartholomew's in Elmshaven for 32 years. Sir Henry Fairfax I attended in his last illness. I kept, for reasons that seemed to me sufficient at the time, and seem to me now more sufficient still, a daily record of his visitors and their business. Sir Edmund Halloway called upon him thrice weekly through the autumn of 1815. He brought papers, he brought a decanter, he brought as witness one Fenn, clerk, whom Sir Henry, being by then feverish, had never before laid eyes upon. On the 9th of November, Sir Henry told me he had signed something, believing it a codicil respecting the North Field. He never left the house that November. He was in Norfolk. Any man who says otherwise says a thing untrue. Ainsworth closed the book. He did not look at Halloway. He did not need to. Halloway's color had gone entirely, and then returned in a bad, mottled way. He stood beside a plaster urn as though it were the last thing holding him upright. His hand crept toward the door and stopped there, useless. "A misunderstanding," he began, and got no further. The Duke had not moved from Arabella's side. Her elbow was still light beneath his palm. He spoke now, and his voice carried without effort to the far end of the marble. "Mr. Cotterell will produce the master seal, borrowed this evening from the Herald's office, so that any gentleman here may satisfy himself. Lord Weston has given his oath. The Reverend Mr. Ainsworth has given his. The steward of Halloway's own estate, Mr. Corbin, deposes that Sir Edmund's clerk Fenn was known to him as a man of poor sight, who signed what was put before him without spectacles. That instrument is a forgery. The debt was never made. The transfer of the Fairfax papers to Portman Square in the spring of 1816 was procured by a false thing. Sir Edmund Halloway has, for 4 years, held the name and the estate of a family who owed him nothing at all. There was, in the hall of the Countess of Marden, a silence of a particular sort. It was not the silence of shock. Shock had passed some minutes before. It was the silence of a great many people arranging, very rapidly and very privately, the acquaintances they would from that hour acknowledge and those they would not. Lady Marden raised her hand. 2 men in the sober coats of Bow Street stepped forward from the vestibule, where Cotterell had placed them at 10:15. "Sir Edmund," the elder said. Halloway's chin trembled once. Then he found, from some cellar of himself, an old officer's discipline, and he bowed to the Countess in the old French fashion, correctly, and he walked out between the 2 men without further speech. Lady Clarissa Vane had not stirred through any of it. Her hand had unclosed at last from Halloway's sleeve and lay now, quite still, in the yellow satin of her lap, as though it belonged to some other woman. The pearls Vane, restored 4 years since from Ranelagh's bank by a purse she had not inquired into, rose and fell at her throat with a breathing she seemed no longer to command. She did not weep. She had never in her life wept where she might be observed. The Duke turned toward her at last, and though his eyes could not find hers could not answer his. "You will leave England, Lady Clarissa," he said, with no more inflection than he would have used to a footman. "You and your aunt. Mr. Cotterell will arrange the passage. I would suggest Lausanne. You will not return within my lifetime. The Countess of Marden has been very kind. You will not, I think, wish to trouble her further tonight." Aunt Augusta, who had been standing behind a Corinthian pillar and had heard everything, came forward at last with a face of chalk. She did not look at her niece. She looked at Lady Marden and dropped a curtsy of astonishing depth for a woman of her years, and then she took Clarissa's arm above the elbow and turned her, quite firmly, toward the door. They went out together, the pearls Vane catching the light of the sconces once and then no more. At the door, Clarissa paused. She looked back only once, and only at Arabella, and what passed between them was not forgiveness and not defiance, but a small, exhausted recognition. The look of a gambler who has seen, at last, the card that was in the other hand all along. Then she was gone. Lady Marden turned to her guests. She had governed rooms of this sort for 40 years, and she did not waste a syllable. "Supper will be served," she said, "in 10 minutes. My daughter will lead in. Miss Fairfax, you will take my arm." It was as complete a rehabilitation as the world of Belgrave Square could offer, and it was offered without hesitation. A dozen women who had, a quarter of an hour before, been prepared to pity Miss Fairfax at breakfast, now advanced with kind and slightly hungry faces to press her hand. Arabella accepted them each in turn. She said very little. She had, in fact, no words left in her at all. Every one she owned had gone into the 6 sentences she had already spoken, and there were none in reserve. But she did, at one moment, turn her head. The Duke's hand had left her elbow when Lady Marden claimed her, and he stood now a little apart, one hand upon the back of a chair, listening. She looked at him across 10 feet of marble, and he, who could not see her, tilted his head half an inch, as though he had felt the look land. "Later," he said, very low, in a voice not meant to travel, and Fletcher, at his shoulder, understood him and did not move. The clock upon the mantel struck midnight as they went in to supper. At the long table, Arabella was placed upon the Countess's right, in the chair which by rank belonged to a marchioness, and which the Countess had, without consulting her steward, rearranged upon the walk from the hall. A footman set before her a plate of white soup she did not taste. The bishop's wife, seated opposite, remarked with an air of long acquaintance that she had known Sir Henry at Bath in the summer of 1809, and had thought him then the pleasantest man in the pump-room. Arabella thanked her and put down her spoon and let herself, for the length of one indrawn breath, believe it. Down the table, 3 chairs distant, Sebastian answered a question of Halstead's without turning his head. He had heard the woman speak. He had heard also the small catch in Arabella's throat. He said nothing of either. Fletcher, standing behind his master's chair with the correct blankness of a well-schooled servant, permitted himself, at that moment, and only at that moment, the smallest tightening at the corner of his mouth, which was, for Fletcher, the equivalent of a shout of triumph. Mrs. Pembroke, when the account was carried to her in Grosvenor Square before dawn by the second footman, put down her candle, and sat a full quarter of an hour in the dark of the housekeeper's parlor without speaking, and then made herself a cup of tea, and drank it standing, because if she had sat, she would have wept, and she would not weep in a house that was to have a mistress again. That night, in the small study at Harrowden House, Sebastian dictated 3 letters, one to Lord Bathurst confirming his signature upon the petition, one to Corbin at Elmshaven instructing the immediate reopening of the house, and one, in his own hand at Cotterell's insistence, to the editor of the Morning Post, so that the version of Thursday's events which reached the coffee-houses upon Friday should be the true one and no other. Then he sat a long time beside the dying fire, and thought about a voice reading Latin under a U in 1815, and about what a man is, and what a man may yet become when he has been very late in seeing. Bathurst signed on Friday. The Act of Parliament for the restoration of the name and estates of Fairfax passed both houses within 9 sitting days, an unusual celerity accounted for by the fact that Lord Halstead had spoken to 17 men before the debate, and Lord Bathurst to 11 more. It received the royal assent at the end of the month. Sir Edmund Halloway was, by that date, held in Newgate upon 2 counts of forgery, and one of the uttering of a false instrument, and the papers he had held for 4 years in Portman Square were carried, in their japanned box, from Cursitor Street to Lincoln's Inn, and thence, in a plain travelling coach, into the county of Norfolk, home. Lady Clarissa Vane and her aunt embarked from Dover in the 2nd week of June. They took with them the pearls Vane, 4 trunks, and a small annuity settled quietly upon Lady Augusta by the Duke of Harrowden, on the sole condition that neither lady's foot should touch English soil again while he drew breath. Lausanne received them. They kept a small house upon the lake, and were not much visited. Corbin, the steward of Portman Square, gave his evidence in open court, and afterward accepted the stewardship of Elmshaven under Arabella's own hand, which he preferred. 3 months passed. They passed as such months do, in the working out of a great many small things. The house in Norfolk was aired and swept, its holland covers folded away, its long-shut windows opened one by one upon the fen. The rector of St. Bartholomew's, having declined a canonry in London, returned to his parish and to a garden he had missed. Miss Marlowe, at length traced, was found to have died the previous autumn in Clifton, quietly, with a copy of Cowper open upon her knee. Her small legacy of books and a workbox came to Arabella by the will she had made in 1818. The locket that had held a grey curl was, upon the very evening of the Restoration Act's passage, taken from Bedford Street to Grosvenor Square, and laid at last in Sebastian's hand, and closed again by him without a word. The garret in Bedford Street was given up in the 2nd week of July. Mrs. Hodge cried, and was given £20 and a cowper of her own, and cried again, and refused to keep the garret unlet for sentiment, and put it about that the young lady who had lodged there had married very well, which in the 3rd week of August was to be true. The engagement was announced from Harrowden House upon a Tuesday. It occasioned in the drawing-rooms of Grosvenor and Berkeley Squares a great deal of comment and very little surprise. The betrothal ball was held upon the last Thursday of August, in the great rooms of the Duke of Cumberland. That hospitable elder statesman, having pressed the loan of his house upon Sebastian, with an insistence that would not be refused. Arabella came down the staircase at Cumberland House at 9:30 in the evening. She wore a gown of wine-dark velvet, cut in the Empire fashion, high at the waist and long in the sleeve, and along her throat lay the parure of Herodin sapphires, 6 great stones set in a collar of old gold, from the coronet of a duchess 3 generations gone, and above the sapphires, at the very hollow of her throat where the velvet met her skin, was pinned a small oval of ivory bordered in a plain rim of silver, cracked along the back, that had once belonged to a woman named Cecilia Fairfax, and had been carried, for nearly 2 years, unremarked, upon a fawn muslin gown at the top of 4 flights of stairs in Bedford Street. The room saw the sapphires first. It saw the cameo second, because the Duke, coming forward to hand her down the last step, laid his fingertip upon the ivory before he laid it upon the sapphires, and the room saw him do it. He said, low, so that no one else heard, "Your mother is here tonight, Bella." She turned her face away for 1 heartbeat only, and turned it back. "So is my father," she said. The orchestra was tuning in the gallery. Sebastian offered his arm. The Duke of Cumberland himself, an old man delighted by any occasion that permitted him to lead a young beauty out, took Arabella down the length of the great room and gave her to Sebastian at the head of the set, and the first dance was called. It was not a waltz, it was a country dance, brisk and formal, and it demanded very little of them beyond attention and grace. They gave both. Arabella had learned the figures as a child in a Norfolk parsonage, and they came back to her hands and feet without effort. Sebastian, who had not danced since 1815, moved with the slight deliberate care of a man who counted his steps and did not mind the counting, and when he mistook once, she corrected him with the pressure of 2 fingers, and no one but he perceived that any correction had been given. At the second dance he took her to the side. It was then that the musicians began the waltz. He said, quite plainly, "I cannot see the room." She said, "You do not need to. I shall be your room." She lifted his hand to her waist and set her own upon his shoulder and looked up at him without any care at all that 400 people were watching, and she led the first 3 bars until he had them, and then he led the rest. The first turn carried them past the great mirror at the room's center, and Arabella saw, for the fraction of a second, the reflection of a woman in wine-dark velvet, moving in the arms of a tall man with a fine cicatrix along his jaw and a fleck of silver at his temple, and she understood, without vanity and without disbelief, that the woman was herself. The music lifted. His hand at her waist was quite steady. She felt, beneath the fine wool of his coat and the linen beneath, the beat of the heart she had, one Thursday in March, been paid £22 10 in coin to read to. It struck a little quickly. So, she noticed, did her own. They turned twice down the length of the floor before anyone else moved. Then Lord Halstead offered his hand to his own wife of 30 years, and the dance filled, and it was a ball again, and Arabella danced with the man who had, in a sense true beyond argument, found her by listening in the dark. Later, much later, when the ball had thinned and Cumberland himself had gone to bed, and the last guests were being handed into their carriages beneath the portico, Sebastian took her by the hand and led her through the small door at the end of the picture gallery and up a private staircase to the library. Cumberland's library was old and low-ceilinged and smelt of leather and pipe smoke and the beeswax with which its shelves had been polished for 60 years. A single lamp burned upon a reading table. A small fire, laid by some anticipating hand, crackled in the grate. Fletcher, silent, closed the door behind them and went away. There was, upon the reading table, a small volume in brown calf. Sebastian's hand knew where to find it. He gave it to her. "Catullus," he said. "Number 5, if you would." She opened the book. She sat, and he sat opposite her, as they had sat 6 months before, in a house in Grosvenor Square, upon a rainy Thursday, with an Ovid between them, and neither knowing yet the name of the other. She read, "Vivamus, mea lesbia, atque amemus," she began, and her voice, which had wanted for bread in March and been silent under 200 faces in May, was steady now, and warm, and unafraid. She read the whole poem through, once in the Latin and once in her own English, and the English she gave him was not the schoolroom version but a new one, made that afternoon in the little sitting-room upstairs at Herodin House, for him. "Let us live, my love, and love," she read, and count the murmurings of old men worth exactly 1 penny. When she had finished, he did not speak for some time. Then he said, "Bella." "Yes. I have heard your voice for 5 years. I did not know your name for 4 of them. I have known it for 6 months. I shall know it, if you will let me, for the rest of the years I have." She closed the book. She rose and came around the table and knelt beside his chair and put both her hands upon his, which had settled palm up upon his knees as though waiting. "Sebastian," she said, "you knew it the day I opened the Ovid. You only did not know that you knew." He turned his hand and closed it upon hers and lifted her wrist and set his mouth against the small mark of ink upon her right forefinger which no amount of pumice and lemon had ever quite removed. He held it there a long moment. Then he raised his head. "Read me one more," he said. She smiled. He could not see the smile. He heard it. She sat again and opened the book at another place and read him 3 more, 1 from Catullus and 2 from Horace, and by the time she had done, the fire had sunk and the lamp guttered, and Fletcher, discreet and unwearied, tapped upon the door to say that Mrs. Pembroke had sent word that Miss Fairfax's carriage was below. They went down together. In the vestibule he handed her the pelisse of dove-gray velvet lined with sable that had been his wedding gift in advance, and he handed her also, from Fletcher's outstretched palm, the small ivory oval that had, in the course of the evening, come loose from its pin and been discovered, unbroken, upon the polished boards of the ballroom. She fastened it again at her throat with fingers that did not tremble. At the door of the carriage he bent his head and kissed her, once, without haste, and once more, and then he handed her in, and the carriage rolled away toward Grosvenor Square, and Sebastian Marbury, 6th Duke of Harrowden, stood a long moment upon the pavement of Cumberland House with his face turned up to a sky he could not see, and he laughed, very quietly, at some old sorrow that had at last let go of him. They were married upon the 12th of September at St. George's, Hanover Square, by the Reverend Josiah Ainsworth, who came up from Elmshaven for the occasion, and who wept once at the vows and once more at the register, and pretended each time it was the London air. Mrs. Pembroke stood in the front pew in a new gown of black bombazine and cried without pretense. Lord Alaric Weston gave the bride away. They kept for their wedding tour not the fashionable cities of the continent but Norfolk, and the road home to Elmshaven, where the long shut gates had been opened and the old dog still remembered her step, and where Corbin, upon the terrace, handed to the new Duchess of Harrowden the keys of a house that had been her father's and would be her son's. She stood a long moment upon the west terrace under a July yew, for they had come in the following summer to keep the anniversary of her father's birthday, and she read to Sebastian, from a book of Ovid bound in green calf with a violet pressed at Bacchus and Philemon, 3 lines she had read 6 years before to an old vicar without teeth, in a voice that a man who could not see her had never afterward forgotten. The world had, in the end, done its arithmetic, a false debt cancelled, a false name broken, a true name restored by Act of Parliament and set upon the register of a Norfolk parish beside a marriage line. A drawing-room that had been prepared to grieve had risen instead and applauded. A ballroom had watched a blind man cross a marble floor by the sound of a voice, and had understood, without needing to be told, what it meant to be truly seen. Cecilia Fairfax's ivory, cracked along the back and mended by no hand, rode home to Elmshaven at the throat of her daughter, and lay there quiet, beneath the sapphires of another house, above a heart that had, at last, no more to prove. For a girl may be poor, and orphaned, and forgotten by every ledger of the world, and still, if her voice be true, one man in the dark may hear her, and one house in Norfolk may open its shutters again, and the whole of a life may turn upon a single afternoon in which she was, for the first time and for always, truly seen. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever been judged by a shabby dress or a worn glove, when the truest part of you was the voice no one bothered to hear? Is there someone in your life who recognized you, really recognized you, before the world remembered your name? And if a forged brooch could nearly cost Arabella everything in a single ballroom, how often do we let a whispered accusation weigh more than years of quiet dignity? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, justice, and love that arrives against all odds, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel